All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Ember, the online think tank born of locals.com. If you've never been on Locals, you probably should. But we're at a time where there's a lot of ideas out there, most of them not so good. We need an improvement in quality of ideas, not just quantity. And so that's what we're here to do. We're to get together to talk about the things facing our society, talk about the issues, and try to come up with substantive solutions to those things and proposals. Does that about sum us up, guys? Is that a good place?
Doing well.
So awesome. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself since I'm facilitating the conversation today, at least until the whiskey kicks in, and then I'm sure that someone will become the designated facilitator. My name is Truman. I have a podcast called Return to Reason, talking about social trajectories and trends, cultural issues, all those kinds of things. And that's me. So we'll just go around on my screen. James, you want to go next, introduce yourself, tell the people who you are.
All right. My name is James Darian. I am one of the co-founders of Ember, and I also run the Locals community commutation construct. So that's what I do. And yeah, good to be here with you guys.
Either you two can go for it, Karlyn.
I'll go. I'm Karlyn Borysenko. I complain on the internet and I knit things, and sometimes I say smart things. And I have a Locals.
Real fast, what are you knitting? What are you knitting today, Karlyn? What do you got
I'm knitting a glorious shawl of Technicolor.
Love it.
Ooh, and I may actually finish it on the call today.
If you finish it, you have to like try it on and show us like the finished product.
Well,
all right.
Obviously.
Good.
I like it. Looks good. It's just very offensive to the colorblind. So
I know.
You're sort of a bigot.
I'm an ableist.
Ableist. That's right.
Right. My name's Kevin. I run engineering politics. If you watch any Truman stuff, I've been on there a few times. I've been with James. I'm in the Karlyn's community. I just talk about general politics, more culture. Sometimes I read books and try to give some sort of review, half sophisticated review of the books and how they apply to the real world. It's basically what I'm trying to do now. But you can check me out on Locals as well. And it's me. I'll be day drinking with Truman. So it'll be between James and Karlyn to either translate or just take over.
Excellent.
I think it makes sense.
Yep. I'm cool with all that. All right. So to recap, we've had previous conversations. We did one where we kind of introduced ourselves. That was, our first episode. The second one we talked about critical race theory, right? We went on about our experiences with that. That's one of the bigger kind of, if you were to say issues facing the country, it's weird to say a theory that, born out of academia is a big threat right now, but it is. And that was the second episode we did, right? I'm not missing one. This is now our third one. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yes.
Okay. So, and we kind of go around picking different topics and what we want to talk about. And whenever I was told that I would be doing this one, I was thinking about like, what are the things that I am wrestling with? And so I'm going to try and keep this from becoming a group therapy session. But I think that it definitely is not exclusive to me. I would say a general fear and anxiety about the trajectory of our country and our unity as a country. Like jokes about like civil war, or now people call it like a Cold War within our own borders of the country. They're not really jokes anymore. They're kind of told with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of attitude behind them. And so I want to talk about that. And I'm really glad. So we originally scheduled this for, I think maybe 3 weeks ago, James, is that right? And we pushed it off, and yeah. And so I'm glad that actually we're doing this now, because I had a trip to Kansas City to visit family last week that was absolutely exhausting for a lot of reasons. But I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm glad that I had that bit of a field trip into the shimmer shade some of the things that I'm thinking right now. But I've heard 2016 described as the year of the red pill, and 2020 described as the year of the black pill. And, for those who are unfamiliar, blackpilled is basically being totally like cynical and nihilistic about the future of our country, the future of our society, of the West, maybe more broadly. And, that's one of those things that whenever I first heard that idea of we're living in a time right now that is more characterized by people being black-pilled than red-pilled, that I was like, ha, ha, ha. oh, wait a second, that doesn't really feel inaccurate, I guess. And, for me, I've definitely wrestled with some of those things. And so what I kind of want to talk about today is, what I put in that, what I would say poor excuse for an outline I sent you guys is, if you were to take a circle that was like all of the descriptions of people who are blackpilled and what they would say their reasoning is for why they are cynical and nihilistic and pessimistic about the future of the country, and take another circle and list all of the things that you would just say are just purely rational, objective observations about our social realities, things going on in the country right now that you would be worried about, that those two circles would have a lot of overlap between them, that they would be a Venn diagram. It wouldn't be like, this is all crazy and this is all grounded in reality. I think there'd be some overlap there. I'm not saying that they would be one circle, but there'd be a lot of similarities between the two. And so what I'd like to go just kind of, I don't know about point by point, but just generally talk about some social realities of the things that we're facing and dealing with, and then the options available to us, I guess, as a way of mitigating those or preventing those things from being further exacerbated. And then maybe try to end on a positive note. Today's Palm Sunday, so that's a hopeful day for a lot of people. So maybe if there's a way to do that, I think I put in the outline, I'll defer to you guys on supplying the hope. I'm here for the cynicism, and you guys can try to offset that with some hope. But does that seem fair? Does that seem like a reasonable kind of place to go?
Yeah.
Does anyone have any thoughts on what I just said before we get started with just some of the first points of some observations that I've made?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say maybe just a real quick second, because I haven't heard of the term black pill until like fairly recently. And so it's good. I think the explanation you gave is good. The first person I started hearing it from a lot is James Lindsay, which seems to be, to not get into it too much, but a guy who had to dive into this stuff and kind of was like at the forefront of fighting this fight, at least in terms of some of the things we're trying to fight against. But I mean, it just seemed like he got tired and started mentioning black pill. Then I heard you mention it a few times, and now it's starting to build up in the lexicon a little bit more. And so not only get red pilled kind of came the same way. So I think it's a really good comparison that, it trickled in a little bit at the beginning, and then it just hit hard. And then you saw a whole bunch of YouTubers and a whole bunch of different personalities get red pilled all at one time. And I think we're getting close to kind of that black pill dam breaking, and you're going to see a lot of, nihilism and people just giving up. So I think it's a really good conversation to have.
I have a little bit of a different understanding of black pill. And I just want to say, because I first heard it from Michael Malice, because he's, I guess, working on a book about do you white pill, like why there's still hope, essentially. Like if you white pill, you believe that there's still hope, there's still reason to fight. Black pill is just like, we've given up on humanity. I just want to say that I'm pretty black pilled right now, but I just like fighting. And so I'll keep that little bit of hope open. I don't think that we should give up, but I don't know that we really have much hope left.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with you, that to me, it seems like it's kind of in our nature to keep fighting, against, against all odds kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Because, the other option is to just kind of lay down and die. And I think our general instinct for self-preservation, fortunately, I guess, drives us to continue fighting even whenever it seems like all hope is lost. I had actually, to what you just said, Kevin, heard the term black-pilled first. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Matt Christensen's podcast, him and his
yeah.
I haven't. I used to listen to his live stuff every Sunday and listen to him all the time. I haven't checked out any of his stuff for a while. But Blonde used to talk about being black-pilled a lot. I mean, back in even, I think 2018 was when I first started, and every Sunday, because they would do these things about hoax, hate crimes and stuff. And she would just say, I'm getting more and more black-pilled every single time. I'm just bring it on. I'm ready to swallow it wholesale. And so I had heard that as far back, as almost 3 years ago. So I think it's probably just like the red pilling thing with something that's maybe more on the fringes. And I think what you said, Kevin, is right, that it's probably the levee's going to break, as per the, why am I drawing a blank on Led Zeppelin song, When the Levee Breaks? I think the levee's going to break on that, probably in short order. So here are some of the realities that I just wanted to kind of talk about. And we can, again, say, is this cause to be hopeless, or is this something that we should just take seriously? But the first thing that I was thinking about, and James, you could probably speak to this with a particular set of expertise. But I was thinking about the size of the U.S. just as an entity, as a physical entity. It seems like, so the U.S. is the third largest country in the world. But we also have very, like, in terms of population density, we're not that dense. I live in the state that has the lowest population density in the country. It's like 500,000 people live here. But in other words, the physical geography of the U.S. and along with what you would maybe say is just our general, the bedrock that we encourage pursuing your own individual happiness and liberty and principles of charity, real liberalism, that creates a set of circumstances that facilitates balkanization in a way that I'm not sure is avoidable. Like, in other words, that if we were all packed together, let's say that the US had the same population, but we were in a lot smaller space, because there's countries that are smaller than us that have larger populations, right? And so if we were in a lot smaller space, I don't think it'd be as easy to balkanize and divide ourselves ideologically, but also physically in the same way that we can, just due to the sheer physical magnitude of the US. And that's how we can get places that are so different within the same place that supposedly shares a governance, shared values, and so on and so forth. That's why I always think about Portland in contrast to where I live, or somewhere like LA in contrast to where I live, and just how radically different those places are. And just the sustainability of that as just like one thing I was thinking about in terms of our ideological separation, physical separation. Because I know, James, you've researched like the rise and fall of empires and stuff.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if the balkanization was part of that or not. Or just what you guys think about just the sustainability. Because I think whenever you first asked me, what are we going to talk about? I think the thing I sent you is something I said, sustaination and Lord of the Rings or something like that. We'll get to the Lord of the Rings part later.
I understood that. I don't understand any of this. I don't know what you're talking about.
Are you serious?
No.
Oh, okay.
Don't take this quadrant seriously right now.
Okay, fair enough. That's a fair point. But anyways, so what do you guys think about just the physical? Like, do you think that the U.S., its size contributes to the way that we can separate along physical lines in a way that is, I guess, long lasting? Like, in other words, it's one thing if we could only do it temporarily, but it seems like we can do this long lasting. We have multiple generations that are radically different and only going to become more and more divergent the longer we go with this complete physical separation of places. And I'll get to like the heuristic I had this, but the way that I think about this is a kid who was, let's say 10 or 12 when was Michael Brown killed? 2013, something like that? 2014. Okay. So let's say a kid who's 10 or 12 in 2014, and one lives in Portland and one lives in like Wyoming or Nebraska or something like that. Rural Nebraska, not like Omaha or Lincoln. And so then that kid is, 12 or 14 when Trump is elected, maybe able to vote in this last election or not, depending. But you have a kid that lives in Portland who's raised by the type of people who would want to remain in Portland, want to remain in Seattle or something like that. And a kid who's raised in a more rural area. And you take those two right now, let's say even just right now, they're like 13 or 14. So they're even younger before. And fast forward 5-7 years and put those two in a room together and tell me I know it sounds like a joke or something like that, but seriously think about their ability to even talk along shared understanding of reality. It seems that they would not be able to do that to me. And I think one of the contributing factors is that the physical isolation because of how big we are that leads to balkanizing. Like, I think we're already unofficially balkanized. So anyway, there's kind of a lot there, but you guys can jump in on that and tell me if that seems like whenever I say this seems like a reality we're facing as an issue, our balkanization along physical lines and ideological lines that match the physical lines is one of those things that I'm seeing as a problem. Does that make sense, or do I need to elaborate on that at all?
No, well, to some extent, the balkanization of the U.S. is by design. It's not necessarily that it's a
fair.
It's not really necessarily that it's an accident that's the case. Like, the U.S. was designed in a way where they wanted free men to own land, to be able to own land and grow and prosper, homestead and the such. So To an extent, there is a balkanization that kind of it just comes with being in America, that we're kind of founded on. Now, that's also why we have our federalist system now. So on one hand, we're allowed to have our own individual identities, but we're supposed to hold the same core, like, binding principles that keep us together. And the real issue is that that's kind of what's coming apart these days.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what James just said. You know, I think back of a time, high school football, something went wrong with the away. We were playing away. Something went wrong with the away locker room. They had to put both teams in the same locker room. That's what I see when I'm thinking of a kid from Portland versus a kid from nowhere, Nebraska, going in the same room together. They're seeing different teams. They're trying to look at each other and figure out, you know, what team are you on? I mean, that's what we see so often. I think that's a rather new occurrence. And I think that comes a little bit hand in hand with the evolution of media and social media that has kind of turned politics into a team game as opposed to how to govern its people. So I think with that relatively short span of evolution in just media, I don't know if we've been able to keep up with it and kind of understand how it can be used, how we can utilize it in a way that actually gives us information rather than, muddies the waters. And we kind of use it for our own purposes. And I think we're using it just as a team game, to me, is what it seems like.
Well, hasn't this always been the case, though? Because I remember I grew up in a very small town in Vermont. I really did not have much of any worldly experience when I went to college. I went to Boston University. And, the one thing that was true about Boston University when I went there is it was full of rich kids from New York City. It was like their backup school, and they all migrated to Boston University when they didn't get into an Ivy League school or whatever. And so, I had nothing in common with so many of the people that I went to school with, and this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I kind of think this has always been like this, but maybe it's, I don't know if it's about politics or if it's just about life experience or what, but I don't think this is a new phenomenon.
I agree with you, but I think it's starting to grow faster because now you don't have to go to a physical location to meet people of opposing views. You just meet them online, right?
Yeah.
So I think you're cultivating that in a different way that we're seeing relatively quick compared to when you went.
Right. It's a bit accelerated.
Well, it's not just that, but there's an important distinction that I would make. Is that, well, a couple things. One is, so let's talk about. I want to go there with what you said, Karlyn, because that's actually really relevant. This idea that it's always been that way. And James, to your point about how that's kind of by design with the US. And so let's look at some of the differences between that historically to where it is now. So like you said, like this bulk, that's what states are, right? I mean, that is, we are divided by different states, but it's these United States. So there's an assumption of shared values underlying this stuff. And I think one of the things I put in the outline was we've always had a divide between rural and urban. I remember, that's why, what was it called? Deliverance was such of a movie that could be made. 'Cause it was like, this is how different this is. I mean, there have been tropes about people that live in these small areas. What's Journey, right? Just a small town girl. And so like we've always understood there is a divide between the rural and the urban. The distinction that I would make is maybe twofold initially, but obviously there's more to it. But I think the two that really matter is that, so think about like dialects. There's always been regional dialects, right? So you can tell if someone is from Chicago or Boston or Louisiana. Like I was on Xbox Live with someone yesterday and I'm like, hey, what's that accent? You sound like from Kentucky or something. And they're like, close, Tennessee. And so I'm like, okay, like I understand that. Or as someone who is maybe in the Northwestern United States, or if you're from Kevin's part of the woods, you might say big instead of bag, right? Like we've always had different dialects for the regions. The difference is now is that we have different definitions of words for regions. So it's not just that there is a different like way that you say things or might think about things, but there is a fundamental difference in the understanding vocabulary of reality. Yes, in the vocabulary that transcends just a phonetic distinction that goes to like a definitional distinction. So like one of the things I put in there was we cannot coexist in a country under the presumed shared governance, where we have different understandings of what the word justice means, what the word oppression means, what the word victim means, what the word man or woman means. So we have, the differences are becoming deeper along those lines. And the other thing that I would add is that these differences have went from novel to contemptuous. So it's not just that we understand that there's a difference between someone who lives in, let's say, St. Louis versus someone who lives in rural Missouri, like in the Ozarks. It's not just that they understand, like, you ain't from around here, are you? You know, like, it's not just that. It's that because of where you're from, I understand, like, to your point, Kevin, about the teams, that we actually have an antagonistic and openly contemptuous relationship. So you can have places that are distinct from each other if they have some sense of shared values and some sense of common respect for each other. But where I would say the difference has changed and evolved into something that is much more volatile is there is not a shared vocabulary of words that do matter. So Karlyn, you said earlier you're drinking a Diet Coke, and that made me think of, so like in Texas, they call every dark soda Coke, right? Yeah. I think that's fundamentally insane. It's like, what kind of, hey, do you want a Coke? Yeah, what kind of Coke? Do you want a Dr. Pepper or something like that? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? But that's manageable. That's manageable. That is not the same as having a different understanding of what man and woman mean, you know, based on where you are. And so does that make sense? Like, do you guys see that as, you know, yes, we've always had these differences, but these differences have become contemptuous. Like, there's actual antagonism and contempt, and real contempt and resentment based along these ideological lines that doesn't seem to be sustainable for me. That is different than those divides have historically been.
So I would say where I would see this is somewhat of a globalization type of issue, or globalism type of issue. Now we've reached a time where people very much, they solidify their own culture, and then they expect for their culture to be respected wherever they go. And in doing so, they disrespect the cultures of the places where they go. This is, I've noticed this to be a big issue when I did work in as a software developer. I noticed that even among work culture, the business development did not speak the same language as the engineers and developers. Like they would say what they needed, what they wanted, but it wouldn't really be able to communicate it across about what those things meant. I actually went to a graduate program and put a lot of my focus into kind of trying to understand how to communicate with people across cultural lines. And what I've recognized is there really, while there seems to be you need to accept other people's culture now, it's turned into a manifest of nobody needs to respect anyone else. No one needs to expect anyone else to respect their culture. So it ends up becoming very insular, where people sort of, because there is this sort of push for people to just acknowledge other people's culture without ever really understanding it. They're just like, oh, that's their culture, you can't defend it. And I believe this has to do with more of an offense-based consumption of reality that's going on these days. It seems to me that I just lost where I was. It seems to me that where people are saying cultures need to be respected, they end up internalizing that as, oh, my culture needs to be respected, I don't need to adapt to anyone else's. It creates a segregation of culture, which is somewhat of an issue when typically, especially in urbanizations, you'll even see in conservative areas, the more concentrated populations tend to be more left-wing, because it's an interaction of many cultures. It's beginning to create almost balkanized. It's fine to have like widespread balkanization where like there's like broad cultures that are, maybe they're different from state to state. But or like even region to region, there's a little bit of variance. But when you get to being in compact areas where there's all this kind of lack of cohesion, lack of what's the word I'm looking for, assimilation into the corresponding cultures, that's when you start to have a lot of issues. That's when you start to have people saying, no, you need to respect me for this. You need to respect me for this. And everyone's asking for something. They're not delivering something to the group.
Well, I want to take a step back. What does it mean to respect someone's culture?
That's a very good question.
Yeah,
because
I was wondering that as well.
So it depends on who you ask, honestly, though. That's one of the problems.
But it doesn't. I don't think so. I think I agree that like respect, like the definition of respect depends on who you ask.
I think with the way definitions have been changing lately, I would definitely say that I believe I have seen people use the term respect very differently.
I say the sky is purple today. The sky is purple today. The grass is blue. That's my definition. Is it true?
Would a better question be what is it commonly understood to mean to respect someone's culture? Because I agree with you, Karlyn. Like objective truth, objective reality, objective morality exist outside of whether or not people acknowledge it as such.
Yeah.
So that's fair enough. But we obviously live in a time where objectivity has become, somewhat of a relic, obviously to our detriment. But would it be fair to ask the question of what does it look like for people to? So if someone said, if you were to take a straw poll might not be the right heuristic to use, but what does it look like for someone from culture A to respect culture B? How would most people understand that to look like? Is that a fair way of characterizing your question of like, how would most people understand that to look like?
Yeah. If you were to ask me, I would say what that would look like is essentially not trying to force your culture on someone, not trying to force your cultural understanding onto someone. You would ask for them to maybe have the patience to consider what you are presenting with your culture, but not necessarily, you're not going to force your culture onto others, and you're not going to, while you won't necessarily expect others, you don't want others to force yours onto theirs, you'd be willing to engage with their culture in a way.
I would say, how about rejecting or almost banning or outlawing tradition based on no form of objective morality? Like there's, when you're talking about it, James, I'm thinking back to, I'm talking to my kids' school and telling them you need to stop preparing the road for the kids of the road. It is them getting rid of basically all traditions thus far, and then kind of there's this new sort of like default reality that's out there. So I use the issue like transgenderism or believing that you're a man when you're really a woman. It's like, okay, we used to say, that's a bit delusional. Now we trying to liberalize and say, okay, you can do what you want. But now it's like the media almost gaslighting us and saying, no, the default position is to be accepting of all, to call a man a woman if she wants to be called a woman, to buy into that sort of, to buy into their delusion, basically. It's like you're now demanded to do so, and now we're switching the game up on you at the last second, and you're getting rid of this tradition of addressing someone as they outwardly appear or as they present themselves to you, right? So I think there's a kind of a backwards way of insulting one's culture by just saying your traditions are invalid automatically, sure. and just moving forward and basically just trucking their culture just over with yours.
Yeah, or claiming that your culture is a default.
Right. So that's fair. I don't want to get too far off in the rhubarb on some of these specific issues, but I think that what you just said there, Kevin, it's a good example of maybe one of those differences between regions, right? So with that, back to the balkanization point, that how someone might respond if someone said, these are my pronouns, or this is who I am, might vary based on where you are. So that goes to my point of that just the understanding of what it means to be male or female is actually now very, very different based on where you live. And, everything is, time. I think Thomas Sowell does a great job to, reference your poster there again, Kevin, which I love. Thomas Sowell does a great job of highlighting how time is a variable in so many equations that people neglect to factor in. And that where you are in the income strata varies according to time. Not even in terms of equality between people. He said not even a man isn't even equal to himself, depending on what point in time you're looking at comparing him to himself. So how could you expect every individual to be equal to each other if we're not even equal to our own selves? Anyway, my point is that time is something that we have to factor in here. And all I'm trying to say is that the divisions and the separation of our understanding of basic realities and laws of reality, laws of cause and effect, laws of how we understand situations is becoming more and more divergent. And it will be worse with every subsequent generation. That's why I give the example of, think of a kid who is this age at this time, and think of a kid who right now. So I think I put this on Twitter the other day, but I know somebody who's telling me about that they work in education also, and they were saying they know about a 6-year-old kid now who literally does not remember a time before masks. Now it's only been a year, so I guess that means they don't remember being 4, but they don't, and they think that this has always been the way, and they'll legitimately ask someone, wait, so we didn't used to always do this? And they're terrified of going back to a time to when we didn't have that. And so just take that kid and fast forward 5, 6, 8 years, with the type of parents that are, I guess, encouraging a lot of this stuff. You have to think about what values are being instilled in somebody, what, again, their own internal heuristics for understanding the world around them are being instilled in somebody. And then let's fast forward, a decade and say, how does that person ever hope to how could it even be feasible for them to participate in shared governance with someone that will do, again, Portland, rural Nebraska, or rural Iowa, or something like that? It seems like it would be fundamentally impossible for them to participate in shared governance because their basic understandings of how the world works, what is true, what constitutes, you have to have a shared understanding of what's true of certain things. There has to be a basic bedrock of, which way is up in order for you to collaborate on things, whether it's in a business setting or whether it's in an educational environment, whether it's in governance. I mean, think about, let's go all the way back. So I'll put on my theology hat for just a second, but everyone knows the story of the Tower of Babel, right? Humans are building this big tower, and God says, no, they're all coming together as one. And the way that he divides them is to confound their languages. He said he understands that the number one way to make sure people will not be able to work together is to confound their languages. And we're now in a time when language is being further and further compounded between people that live in a place where we're supposed to collaborate together in terms of how we govern ourselves. Does that make sense? Yeah. So Kevin, it looked like you're about to say something. Sorry. I don't want to keep going.
No, it's about to grab a drink. It sounds really good.
Okay.
No, I totally agree with you though, but it is a language game, which is, explicitly, not trying to make this conversation just me saying the other side's wrong, but I mean, that's a common theme you find in Marxism and neo-Marxism is the control of language is huge. I mean, that makes a huge difference. Now, I don't know if it's just explicitly a push from people who are or left-minded, or if it's just us, trying to play into a more of a multiculturalism game. If speaking of Thomas Sowell, he kind of really, tries to fight against the idea of multiculturalism. As long as if you want to build an equitable society, right? Because you can't build equality or equity, equal outcomes if you're going to have diverse cultures. You're going to have unequal outcomes. It's just you have to pick one or the other. You can't just do both. And
Exactly.
Even the idea of like a disparity, not Thomas Sowell, but a guy who wrote about Thomas Sowell. I read that he had a really good line that the idea of a disparity is something that must be held as guilty until proven innocent. Like, what kind of crazy world is that? I mean, that's a major change in language that doesn't sound, radical to the everyday person until you look at, every input has a disparate output. And when you look at that through the lens of everything, I mean, everything's going to change in its definition and its utility if you're going to look at it through that lens. So even that small change, that subtle change there is a major change that are going to set people off depending on, what they believe. If they want to fight for equity, or if they want to say, we want to fight for equal opportunity, and let the cards fall where they may.
Well, I just want to jump in here and say that I also think we need to acknowledge that this controlling of language is not something that's exclusive to the left. I mean, I watched a debate just the other day in which Bryson Gray was arguing that LGBT people do not exist. He was actually arguing that homosexuality was not a real thing because the Bible says it's a sin. And, that's crazy. But he also does represent this authoritarian portion on the right that is, maybe it's a backlash to what's going on the left, and they're just, pushing back in any way they can. But they are very literally denying parts of, if we want to talk about respecting people's culture, they're denying people's, ability to love whoever they want to love as even, something that exists. So I think this is happening on both sides.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of similarities between those both sides.
100%.
They both operate as corrupt religions.
But I'm more trying to make observations about the realities, not necessarily fault or causal relationships or give moral judgments to it. There obviously would be some things that I would agree more with than other things, but the whole point I'm trying to make, and I think Karlyn, that's a great point, is that this is divergent along both lines. It's not like the right is doing this and the left is doing this. Correct. It's that both sides are doing this. So whatever that looks like that would be one example of how that is manifesting. I'm just saying it's happening. It's happening, and it's happening not just, and this is what I think is the really important part. It's not just happening in a way that is purely just in terms of our relationships and how we think, but it's happening physically. That is what seems to be the really important distinction here, is it's happening physically, that these divides, like whenever we're all a melting pot and mixing together where we have to work together, we have to get over those differences. But the balkanization and whenever you have divergences along ideological and physical lines, that is where I'm saying that we are in trouble there, because you now have no incentive structure remaining to actually collaborate together. In fact, you have incentives to not work together because it's about protecting, you have nothing in common with the person you're supposed to work with.
Well, but here's the question I have. I agree with you that it's happening. I don't think we can deny that. Is it happening on the scale that it would need to in order for this to be a problem, though? Because saying something is happening is different than saying it's happening at the required scale.
So that's a fair question. I would say that if you were to take, let's say, a graph where it has to go up like this, and at some point there's a line where it says this is the threshold where the physical divide is very relevant. Mm-hmm. I would say it's going up like this. We haven't hit that line yet, but it's trending upward, and the incentives that are causing that to happen are increasing. So, the things that I would just put, if I were to just shotgun things that are just very, very different that are dividing people. Education is a big one and only going to get worse. There are people who do not want their daughters competing for athletic scholarships with biological males at schools. And as you see a lot of these places where they're allowing for that athletic competition, even at a K through 12 level, which is happening, there are people who are like, I don't want to be a part of that. So their kids' education is going to be a big part of it. Their experience with the education system, whether it's the transgender stuff or just what they're being taught. So 1619 stuff, for example, Kevin, I think you're a good example of someone who wants to move to a different area. And a big part of that seems to be the education of your kids. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And I think I don't want to stop you if you're not done with whatever you're going to say.
I'm not done, but just go ahead and jump in on that point real fast.
Well, I always feel bad because you got to cut someone off in order to talk here. But to your point, I think, there's a sustainability limit basically, or like a yield point or something like that, where, you go too far and that's too far. In education, I can move. If we go far enough to say, all right, Wisconsin is now off limits to me if I want a proper education for my child, or what I see as a proper education, I'll just move to Texas and I'll get an education there. Okay, that's fine. We have different ideas ideologically, but maybe our founding principles aren't different. When we can't agree on truth, I think that limit that you're talking about, we're probably already past it. Like there are basic truths that we can't agree on, and we cannot build we cannot maintain a sustainable society if we can't agree on basic truths.
Yep.
If we can't agree that skin color should have nothing to do with how we treat you, but we're going to treat you now based on skin color, or treat you differently based on skin color. That's a truth we cannot live with if we can't agree on that simple idea.
Well,
so I think in some ways, I think we're past this limit already.
Hang on. There was a time when that we did not agree on that. And frankly, for a great deal of the history of this country, we did not agree on whether or not you could treat people differently based on the color of their skin. And then a lot of people fought back against that idea, and laws were passed, and we made progress. And yes, I mean, things are certainly getting very regressive now, but let's not pretend that we're back to where we were in the 1800s, because I mean, we've already been through this once.
Yeah, but if you look at that limit, we had a civil war.
Yep.
Like there's
actual physical
there's consequences for those limits. And when I'm not saying you can't ever come back from this. I don't think we're too far that we can't come back. I don't think we're that far yet, but we're past the limit of where we can agree to disagree and just, use federalism to move to different red states and blue states. I think we're already ventured past that point if we try to sustain where we're at now.
I don't agree, because the Ku Klux Klan was created after the Civil War. Like, the Civil War was won, and things were still really, really bad for a long, long time.
Well, then we got to talk about trends. What direction are you trending? Like, we were trending toward more freedom, more individual freedom. You can't expect, even with the Civil War, you can't just say, unless they agree to kill off the other side that lost, which we didn't agree to because we recognize we were neighbors. It's going to hopefully trend in a better direction, which it did. Now I think we're trending the wrong way, and we don't want to get too far.
So to Karlyn's point, let's go back to just this basic notion of thinking about ideological divides physically, right? So things were, Kevin, if you remember our conversation about the post-Reconstruction era and the hierarchies, things were actually trending really well in the South. So we have to use Mason-Dixon line if we're going to use this example. We're trending really well as long as there were people there, the federal troops from the North, that were forcing them to continue along the lines that they had started. Once the troops from the North left, that's, and after Reconstruction was 10, 20 years, so maybe 15, then you saw the South regress back to balkanization. That's where you get Jim Crow. That's where you get the KKK and stuff, until there had to be another intervention in the form of the Civil Rights Act that made it where they couldn't do that anymore on a legal basis. So it was getting better. Civil War, slavery is abolished. It's getting better. And then it starts to get worse because of that ideological balkanization between the North and the South. Think about how different Montgomery, Alabama would have been from maybe Chicago or something like that at the same time. And it was getting better. And then it gets worse until an intervention has to occur that forces the South to be on the same ideological level as the people who in the North who are saying Jim Crow is awful. You can't do this anymore. And so they were forced to assimilate in that manner. That's what the Civil Rights Act was, by making where Jim Crow laws and segregation that were not, de facto segregation were not legal anymore. And so, that's a good example. And that's a good point, that as things got better, they were obviously getting better, but when they started to get worse, it required correction again. So Civil War and then Civil Rights Act, where they were exactly 100 years apart almost. The Emancipation Proclamation was 1863. Civil Rights Act was 64 or 63. So I know it's 64 because MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech was exactly 100 years. Anyway, after that, but it doesn't matter. The point is that it required correction that created that ideological assimilation. And we now are in a time where that's not happening. There's nothing forcing that ideological assimilation along those geographic lines. Does that at least address a little bit about what you guys were just talking about?
Yeah, I think so.
We're also going through an interesting time because due to the way online dialogues are able to occur, it kind of creates, it ends up creating digital balkanization, where in the physical reality, balkanization will not mirror the way it typically would. It ends up creating a situation where there is balkanization within communities, because the people within different communities may be engaging with completely different communities online. So there's a bit of an issue there that I think is also really pushing for this, pushing for kind of this more rub against, what's a phrase I'm looking for? I'm forgetting all my phrases today.
Social friction. I understand.
Social friction. There we go.
That's right. And that's a good point, because that online space, I wrote an article back maybe in April or something of last year where I said we need to open back up again, and not in the way you're thinking. And I talked about how COVID drove everyone online into their ideological echo chambers, and how we needed to open back up and get out of those echo chambers, because it's further exacerbating those divides. I think it's an excellent observation, James. So just to kind of cap off this physical part of the conversation, would you guys say, like, I want it to be an open-ended question. I don't want to say yes or no, but how far off am I in at least seeing that the way that our physical proximity is trending more and more to match our ideological differences, so that we are isolating and self-segregating in a way that makes it to where people don't just live in one place physically, but they also live in one place ideologically, so that places are growing more and more radically different in their ability, not just to understand each other, which is fine if you don't have a shared system of governance, but we do have a shared system of governance, presumably, so that requires collaboration, and that our ability to collaborate, it seems like, is being hindered more and more by our separation ideologically and physically. And so is there any merit to that? I know that's a yes or no question, but does it seem like that there is something, is there any there, or is that fall in the circle of I'm blackpilled and being delusional, or is this a legitimate thing that we should be at least wary of or aware of?
Well, I think it's a legitimate thing, but I'm not sure that would be the reason I would blackpill, because I'm not sure that it's happening at a scale that is necessarily required. And I also think, people.
Do you think it's trending that way? I don't know. Do you think people are moving closer to people that they disagree with or agree with?
Some people are, but again, I don't have a sense of if it's in a large enough proportion. I mean, we know people are leaving New York City. We know people are moving to Florida. We know people are moving to Texas. And sometimes I think that, we talk about these issues so much amongst ourselves that we might perceive it to be a bigger move, a bigger shift than it actually is. And I'm not saying one way or the other. I don't have the data in front of me to say that this is happening at the scale required for this long-term problem to solidify. I also think there's something, and I feel like I'm playing devil's advocate today, but we've always existed in different communities, always throughout our entire history, whether that be from political or just other things. I mean, maybe you have a hippie commune over here and stuff's going on over here. And, we've always had this thing where people are kind of in their own communities. I think the thing that's making it difficult right now is, frankly, there's one population that is in touch with reality, and there is another population that is making shit up. That, I think, is the biggest difference. And I think that we can look at some of these more urban areas and say, yeah, people are making stuff up in New York City. People are making stuff up, largely in California or more predominantly liberal areas. But does that equate out to the majority of the country? I'm not sure I'm convinced it does.
Does it have to be the majority, or does it have to be enough of a representative population to create sufficient divisions?
Well, fair enough point, but I'm going to be. I think I'm less worried about this problem in places that are not New York City and Los Angeles.
I think in general you only really need to have a plurality for issues to really become terrible. But regarding this, I actually, if you look at balkanization, it's really a question of scale. The ultimate level of balkanization is the individual. Individuals are different from other individuals. So there's a bit of an issue. There are a few different issues with this, where one, there's definitely a push of fundamental beliefs within the US where ideologies are, the US as a culture is designed around the concept of individualism. We are now having subcultures that do not believe in individualism. They believe in their small communities, or not necessarily communities, but groups, however they group them, be it sexuality or race or whatever they may choose. They basically erase the individual. That is one problem. But the real issue is that if it was a localized community that was doing it and everyone was interested in thinking that way in that community, that wouldn't really matter to the people outside of that community. The real issue is the scale where the different groups are trying to basically force their own ideologies up the ladder. So while some things would normally be considered state issues, they're being made federal issues. And the larger the scale, the broader the interpretation should be. The broader the subject matter should be. That's a really important point.
It's good.
So
yeah, sorry, I thought you were done.
Oh, I was just going to finish up saying, so when we have these issues being subdivided on such a granular level, but at such a large scale, that's where you're going to really get that tension and that social discohesion that's going to really start to affect people's day-to-day lives. And that's where I think the black pill starts to come in, at least from my perspective.
So yeah, when I think of people like dividing physically, I always think back to, which this might not be important at all, but you go through a neighborhood, it's got all Biden signs, and it seems like every iteration of every election, there's more of one type of sign there and less of the opposing view. So that could either be someone just being quiet, or it could be people just being like, all right, these people all vote for Biden, so I'm going to change my mind. Or it's people, okay, I'm moving out into, a Trump neighborhood where I'm going to see a bunch of Trump signs. That could be a sign of something like this, or that this might be, whatever, it's politics. I don't know, but
go ahead. Sorry, finish. My bad.
Well, to move on to like the black pill phenomenon, I think a black pill, I suppose everyone would have their own threshold, right? Their black pill threshold, I suppose. And, I think about these the pill commercials that have, it's 30 seconds of cool people laughing, sitting in different bathtubs, holding hands. And then it's a minute and a half of all the symptoms of the pill, and all the stuff. So I don't really know how these symptoms come out in every individual, but all I can say is, if you mean black pill has something to do with people being more cynical and turning more nihilistic, well, the thing with nihilism is it is deadly and it's contagious. So if you're gonna say that it doesn't need to be a large portion of people, I would caution you to understand that if nihilism is what's in this is a natural symptom of black pilling, it's extremely dangerous, and I think you don't want to wait for it to grow in population before you start to become concerned.
Regarding that,
sorry.
After you.
Well, no, I was gonna say something that was not related to what Kevin just said. So you should, if you have something like that, you should.
So I was just going to say regarding the nihilism thing, it's among my generation and younger, even before COVID, it was rampant. It's incredibly rampant among, I would say, anyone under 30 these days.
That's one of the things that Jordan Peterson addressed, why he was able to gain so much popularity, is that all these young men searching for meaning. But that's a whole nother thing. And so, like, to kind of go back to what I was talking about in terms of those issues, and Kevin, I think it's a good point that that's contagious for sure, is, because we see this well, let's just talk about two things. There is actually data to support it. We know that whenever public suicides happen, suicides spike, right? Because those types of things are contagious. The other thing, to your point, Kevin, about if you move to an area and you see signs for Biden or for Trump, you tend to see more of those things. And we do have data to support that. I've cited multiple times Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, about how if you live in a neighborhood or an area that has more coffee shops than gun stores, it's more likely to vote blue. And if you live in an area that has more gun stores than coffee shops, it's more likely to vote red. And we also know that, and this is a Pew Research thing, I think, that however you vote, the odds of your immediate neighbors and the houses around you physically voting the same way are very high. So people have already started to cluster ideologically, but the part that I'd like to kind of transition to after just laying out some of these other realities is what that looks like, the differences between how they see each other. But so, I think we started to get off on a little bit of a tangent. It was a good one whenever I was talking about educational or differences in preference for education, differences in preferences. So let's go to, I have been railing for a while about vax IDs and how this is going to be relevant in some places and not in others. You know, I got a text from my sister yesterday who is 28, 29. And she was so excited. She got her vaccination ID card, not ID card, but like certification of how she got her vaccination. And I held off. My mom doesn't have the same self-control that I have, but I held off, you know, I wanted to say something like, well, I'm glad you have that, because I wouldn't want you to be within the, you know, 42 people who are healthy and your age that have died from this thing. But, you know, anyway, but because she's healthy, she's not, she doesn't have any underlying health issues.
That's fine. I'm going to get vaccinated tattooed on my lower back.
That's good. And you should do that. And I am excited for that. I actually do know a guy who had a lower back tattoo, and it was like one of those things where it's like, I thought this is only in movies that this was a thing. Like, but anyway,
I have a lower back tattoo. All right. Lay off.
You're also not a dude.
Yeah.
And I believe that
it's different.
Anyway, so I just had jokes in my head. It's fine. Okay. So back on track. But my point is that how COVID vaccinations as like what people's choices are there become more and more relevant. I don't know if you guys saw this yesterday that Dunkin' Donuts, Krispy Kreme is giving away a free glazed donut every day for the rest of the year to anyone that brings their Vax ID card in. So, and like, as you go into places where even if their states remove different mandates, this is back to like an Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill kind of thing about social tyrannies versus governmental tyrannies. You're finding places, even when their states remove mask mandates and stuff, that there are businesses. I don't know if you saw, like, there was some stuff in Texas even where there were businesses that were like, there's a surcharge of $50 if you come in here without a mask, and a $75 surcharge if we have to explain to you why that's important. And I think that sign is probably in Austin, that's its own little microcosm there. But my point is that people aren't going to want to live in the places that have this kind of thing. You know, where I live, well, I just went to a grand opening for a business yesterday. A friend of mine who has a leather company, and he's been doing stuff mostly online and traveling, going to different shows. And they finally have an actual storefront, and they had a grand opening. It was packed yesterday. Pretty much no one was wearing masks in there. Again, most people in my community have already had it and are fine. We don't know a single person who's died of it. But I mean, knock wood, right? But either way, the point is that I live in a place where a lot of businesses have opened over the last year. I've seen a sporting goods store open. I've seen multiple restaurants open. I've seen a brewery open. I've seen a wine bar open. We had a boba tea, talk about a niche type thing. We had that, you know, one of those types of businesses open. And I live in a very small town, 30,000 people approximately. And so, like, there are other places where businesses are closing, where people have this idea that we're in some Great Depression and all of these other things. And so whether it's the vax stuff, the COVID guidelines of, you know, I'll be honest, whenever I see like a 5-year-old outside wearing masks, playing with other kids, I'm like, it really bums me out. Like, and what's funny is that this is this little side tangent just about me, but I have the receipts to prove it in terms of tweets and content I made during last spring and last summer, where I took anti-maskers to task. I was like, this is dumb. Like, we obviously know that these work. Like, the fact that you would even be opposed to this thing, this is a control thing, is absurd. But we now seem like we're at the point where it actually is becoming a control thing. Like, they were probably wrong and right at the same time. They were just wrong, but early to the conclusion, you know, last April, May, whatever. Whereas now I think that a lot of that is right. But my point is that people aren't going to live in those places. That's all I'm trying to say, is that people aren't going to want to live in those places, whether it's stuff with the education, stuff with the way that COVID's like, are you going to want, what if you don't want to get a vaccination, but your job is going to require it? You're going to move to a place where that's not the case. You're going to move to a place where you like aren't going to see homeless people masturbating on the sidewalk or taking a dump and dirty needles and stuff. Whenever I was in Kansas City, that's where I was born. I was in that city, you know, basically for the last, 34 years. I've never seen tent cities before there. And I saw tent cities there because they passed a law this last fall legalizing public camping. You know, it's like, okay, well, what happens in the places where that occurs? It's like, who looks at their sidewalk and goes, we don't have enough turds on this sidewalk. We need to make it where we get more turds on these sidewalks. Mm-hmm. And so my point is that people aren't going to want to live in those places. And that's already happening. The trends of coffee shop, gun store, and the people around you vote the way you do, that's already been happening. And it's only getting worse. So those are some of the realities that I think of. Am I crazy on those realities, the physical stuff, the ideological differences? And if not, like, what would you guys add maybe to that or anything? Because I want to get to the next part of what Karlyn brought up about how we've always had these differences. But those are just some of my gut reactions. I feel like I've been rambling. Okay, I'm done.
I just want to say I'm just going to pat myself on the back for being against masks from the beginning, to be precisely to avoid the exact problem that we're having right now. And that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think we have a problem when we try to establish or make, everything so political. I think you move into the oxymoronic, which is like a satire of reality. So you have Krispy Kreme giving away free donuts when obesity is one of the top pre-existing conditions that lead to higher mortality. I mean, that is when you get into oxymoronic
including
territory.
among COVID.
Especially
Well, yeah, that's what basically I was pointing at. I guess higher mortality in general, but I mean, that's where you go. You start to go into a satire of reality, and as funny as it is, it's a dark comedy, not a light comedy.
I'm still muted. Okay, so fair enough. So those are some of the realities that it seems like we're kind of facing now in terms of social divisions and trends. Now, Karlyn, I think your point is accurate that I agree that we're not there. I agree we have not hit the threshold of where we need to be. We might not even be close. So I'll readily concede that we might not even be close. The only point that I make, and that I've made in videos in the past when I talked about the Watchmen threshold, I mean, we're at 2 years ago now at this point, but is that we're trending that way. That's all I'm saying, is that whether or not we're there or not, everything moves in trajectories, and our current trajectory is trending towards whatever the threshold is, whether that's 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 50 years down the road. I don't know. My point is that we're going that way. So if someone is walking to, the Pacific Ocean, whether they're in Lincoln, Nebraska, or whether they're, in Las Vegas, Nevada, the question really is, are they moving west? If you're moving west, you're going to hit it eventually. And I'm saying we're moving that direction with all of these trends is all I'm getting at. I don't know if we're in Las Vegas, and I don't know if we're in Lincoln, or we might still be way back in Columbus, Ohio, but we're going that way is all I'm saying. Sorry, go ahead, Karl.
No, I mean, I agree with you that we're trending that way. I just, again, like, I don't know how close we are. And to be honest, and I appreciate this discussion, but I'll throw out there that the reason that I'm blackpilled is not because of where people are living, where they're moving, are we too divided? It's because government is screwed. It is incredibly broken. And I think that this does intersect with what we're talking about somehow, because the only reason it's this broken is we've gotten to this point of everything has to be the most extreme thing in order to get anyone's attention. And so all the politicians are doing are digging into the most extreme of their party so they can, get on the news to talk about their new big thing. And the news is framing it as the most extreme thing in the world so they can get clicks by having the most outlandish headline. Like, our government, our federal government at least, is almost irreparably broken in that regard. I don't think that I don't think there's anything turning that around. I don't care, because it's, for so many different reasons, not the least of which is good people don't want to run for office. And so we're stuck with all these snakes that are only in there because they want power and money, and that's it. And so I think that, to bring it back to kind of like the geography thing, I think there is something to be said for the only way we can make any tangible progress is in local government. And so how that plays into all this, I don't know, but I just want to throw, that's the reason I'm blackpilled, is because of where the federal government's at.
We're going to get to that exact issue. I have that on that.
Excellent.
That's the Lord of the Rings thing.
Yeah. I was just going to say, and we have that issue of everyone making their issues into federal issues rather than local ones where they would be far more relevant.
Yeah, they transcend any of those steps. Okay, so let's go on to, because I really want to get to this other thing that I think is such an important distinction in terms of, again, so I think it is very relevant to say, look, we've always had differences. We've always been divided. Again, I would point out that there are we've seen this in movies, TV shows, everything like that. But the main distinction that I would make in terms of that historically to that now is the nature of the relationships between those who are part of the urban or rural and those who are part of the metropolitan or sorry, the rural outside and those who are part of the urban metropolitan type thing. And that's not an exact one for one, but it's close enough to get to where we need to be in terms of understanding it or understanding the problem that we're facing, at least as I see it. Correct me if any of you guys, if you see flaws there, I'm sure there are, but and that is that, again, that went from novel to just, we understand this is a different thing, to maybe a bit antagonistic to now it's contemptuous, that there is actual contempt for people along ideological lines, and that's increasingly becoming physical, but we can ignore the physical for the time being. But there is now active contempt between people along those differences. So it's not just, yeah, I get that you're from a different area, you have a different dialect, you might call Dr. Pepper Coke, whatever, but then now there's active contempt there. And I wanted to get into a little bit, I like using relationship lenses for understanding a lot of our social pathologies and social trends. That's where all of that came from. For anyone watching this unfamiliar, in terms of looking at the similarities between emotional abuse and the way far left orthodoxy operates within relationships, I use a relationship lens there. And I think it's actually incredibly valid and informative for doing that. And so I want to look at just how contempt plays into relationships. Karlyn, I assume you're familiar with John Gottman. Are any of you other guys familiar with John Gottman? He's probably one of the best longstanding relationship experts in the country, maybe even the world. He's been doing this at this point for maybe 40 plus years. I first heard of Gottman whenever in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, which is a good book. He talks about, he has a whole section on Gottman and how Gottman got so good at understanding human interactions that he could watch like a 10 to 15 second clip of a couple and tell with, I think, above 80 to 90% accuracy whether or not they would be together within a year or 2 years or something like that. He was that good, and he could even do it without sound. So if he just watched people interacting with no audio whatsoever, he could predict it with a very high degree of accuracy how long they would be together. So the point is, he's a relationship expert that is probably unparalleled in his understanding of this. And he has these things he calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that kill relationships. And he says the number one killer of relationships is contempt. And so I want to read an excerpt here from his website about contempt. And then let's try to map this onto our social relationships, in terms of antagonism or tensions between the different groups in this country, different ideologies. And you can tell me if this is accurate or inaccurate. So, quote, contempt is the worst of the 4 horsemen. It is the most destructive negative behavior in relationships. In John Gottman's 4 decades of research, he has found it to be the number one predictor of divorce. According to Malcolm Gladwell in his bestseller, Blink, which again, you guys should read, it's a great book. If Gottman observes one or both partners in a marriage showing contempt toward the other, again, one or more, it doesn't have to be both. He considers it the most important sign that the marriage is in trouble. When you communicate with contempt, the results can be cruel. Treating others with disrespect and mocking them with sarcasm and condescension are forms of contempt. Think that CNN clip with Don Lemon and whoever else. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so are hostile humor, name calling, deplorables, mimicking, and body language such as eye rolling and sneering. In whatever form, contempt is poisonous to a relationship because it conveys disgust and superiority, especially moral, ethical, or characterological superiority. Contempt, simply put, says, I'm better than you, and you are lesser than me. Contempt is fueled by long, simmering negative thoughts about one's partner, and it arises in the form of an attack on someone's sense of self. Inevitably, contempt leads to more conflict, particularly dangerous and destructive forms of conflict, rather than reconciliation. It is virtually impossible to resolve a problem when your partner is getting the message that you're disgusted with them and that you're condescending and acting as their superior, whether it's on the right, acting as intellectually superior, or on the left, acting as morally superior. I'll do both because those are both accurate descriptions. Anyway, continuing. Contempt is the most poisonous of all relationship killers. We cannot emphasize that enough. Contempt destroys psychological, emotional, and physical health. And then they went on, and I paraphrased one part of it where they talk about, okay, how can you defeat contempt? Defeating contempt requires developing fondness and admiration for the other. Often this is accomplished by reflecting on your shared history, positive past interactions, and what you appreciate about the other. And then my own personal note there was, this requires having a shared history. This requires having proximity where you can reflect on those things generally. It requires physical proximity, in other words, for the most part. And so it seems to me that, so I'm just going to posit two conclusions, and you guys can, agree, disagree, whatever, refine it. One is that the differences between these areas and these ideologies, to your point, Karlyn, that have always existed, has become contemptuous. And that it's not just we understand that there's difference, but that both sides in their own way actively have contempt for the other. And that the remedies that we know that can help alleviate and reverse contempt in relationships do not seem to be available on a macro level, at least, to us in terms of resolving that contempt or dissipating that contempt. It might exist on some micro level. So for example, if you have a tension between two people in a family, although that in and of itself, I think poses some difficulties. How many things have we seen on social media about families that or members that have cut ties with other members over political differences? But on a macro level, I would say that does not seem to be available to us, because I don't have a shared history with someone who lives in Seattle or someone who lives in Portland. I just don't. I don't have a shared understanding of reality, and I don't have a shared history that I can reflect on fondly to help me develop admiration. And that basic principle that we were founded on in terms of respecting each other, mutual respect for the individual and their liberties and their rights, that was supposed to be ingrained in the US. Again, I think our founder said this is only sustainable if we have a moral population and a virtuous population that understands these things. That there's an asymmetry between those who have that, or at least try to fight to have that, and those who don't. So my two assertions here are that, one, contempt has become one of the defining characteristics of the relationships between those with ideological differences, and two, that we do not have an easy or readily available or obvious solution for alleviating that contempt on a macro level. So do whatever you want with that, but that's why I went from the physical to this thing that seems to characterize those relationships. So go wherever you want. I'm going to drink.
I agree with you on both counts. And I think that, one of the things that you said in that is particularly pertinent in this situation is that it doesn't have to be on both parties. It only needs to be on one party. And I mean, the fact is, like, when Joe Biden got inaugurated, and even in his, leading up to the inauguration, he declared himself the unity president. Unity. He didn't mean a word of it. There are so many things that he could have done to just maybe not fix the relationship between his supporters and Trump supporters overnight, but soften it. Not show blatant contempt for Donald Trump, not refuse to mention his name, not speak about him with malice every single time his name comes up, not lie about what happened in Charlottesville when we all know that that's not the truth. And so he had so many opportunities where I actually really do think that if Joe Biden had tried, if he had extended some sort of, even if it was like the tiniest olive branch in the world, I really think that many, not all, but many Trump supporters would have been open to it, to at least not have animosity towards each other, right? Because, that's at least been my experience with the majority of the people on the right, is that they do want to have a love your neighbor philosophy, even if they don't agree with you. But they don't, if you hate them, they don't really see the point in it. But Joe Biden elected not to do that. The Democrats elected not to do that. And, there's no going back on that now. You don't get a do-over.
Yep. Let me add one thing onto that, because that's a really important thing you just said there, Karlyn. It reminded me of something else, going back to Malcolm Gladwell. He gives a talk about this concept of legitimacy and authority and in power. You can find it on YouTube. It's an older one. And he says that because he talks about what leads to revolutions. So he's thinking about on a governmental level, on a macro societal level. But he says one of the things that causes someone to have a perception of legitimacy with those who are in charge is the fact that they feel heard. And he said that if you look at places where even if someone does nothing with your complaints, they don't act on them at all, they literally do not take one single step to try and address them or alleviate them. If a person at least feels heard, that they listened to me and that they took it seriously, that alleviates tension and conflict way more than if they don't feel heard. So again, just the mere act of someone listening, saying, I take what you're saying seriously, and I heard you, and I want to hear you. Like, a person just feeling they were heard goes a long way, even if nothing was done to address it. Because then they will also, because if they feel heard, then they have enough emotional buy-in where the other, or the person who listened to them, has enough emotional buy-in to say, hey, I heard you. Here's why I can't do anything about that right now, but I heard you. And if you feel heard, then you can handle the fact that they might not do anything to address it in the moment, because you trust them, So what you said, Karlyn, like, I think that's an excellent point. That, let's say, for example, Biden got up there and said, I know there's a lot of people that don't feel like this election was legitimate. And, obviously I think it is. That's why I'm standing up here, delivering a State of the Union or whatever inaugural address. But so that we can make sure that you feel heard, here are all the things I'm going to do to make sure that we have election transparency for the next election. Like, here are those things, because I hear you. I want you to know I hear you. So that'd be one example. But I think that you're exactly right, that there is nothing that even resembles an olive branch. And an olive branch, again, why I brought up the hearing part, it doesn't even have to be actually doing anything. It just has to be being able to articulate what someone says back to them in a way that they say, yes, I agree. That's it. And at least right now, that side is not interested in doing that. And those in charge of the government are not interested in doing that, of saying, I understand your concerns. I take them seriously. Here's what at least I understand them to be. Do you understand? Do you agree? Is that right? If not, how? And so that I can work on trying to address those concerns. But that being heard, and therefore, with that not being there, the concept of legitimacy for a lot of people who do not have that, or do not feel like they were heard, there is not a perception of legitimacy of those in charge right now. And again, I would say that same thing goes from there's arrows from left to right both ways. No one on the right talks about student loan debt issues. And so therefore, everyone on the left who is saying, hey, we have to do something about student loans and tuition, they don't feel heard by those on the right. So again, this is not about like who's worse at it than the other. It's just about laying out the realities of how this relationship is becoming more and more corrosive and filled with tension, where neither side is listening to each other. They're diverging more and more on all these other things we've talked about, and they don't feel heard or respected. And again, to my assertion that I feel like as such, they have more and more contempt for each other. And as Gottman said, it's a number one predictor of divorce. What is divorce? A separation. It is a permanent break in the relationship. So if we extrapolate that on a macro level, it seems like if we have nothing but contempt, or at least there seems like a plurality or an idea of both sides have nothing but contempt for each other, or at least we're in a milieu characterized by that, it seems like on a macro level, we're heading for some type of permanent separation, divorce. And again, tell me which circle that's in. Is that being blackpilled, or is that reading the room? I don't know. But I just wanted to add that to what you said, Karlyn, because I think that's a really important point, what you said there. All right, I'm done again.
Yeah, I think contempt, especially like the history of contempt. I mean, the sayings of the inbred idiots in middle America versus the rich snobs on the coasts have always been an area of contempt that even if you've never met anyone on the coast, or you've never met anyone in middle America other than waving over to them as you're flying from New York to LA, there's no shared history, which I think is a really important point. What I'm concerned with is we're building a shared history, and it's mostly online, and it's not good. So there is what's almost functioning, I would say similar. I'm not the expert here at all on abusive relationships, but I know, if you have an abusive relationship, they reflect on a shared history of just abuse, of different instances of abuse. I don't think coming together is in the cards, which is something that's more scary to me. So if you take that example of Biden, I think there are some of the anti-Trump conservatives, I call them, who said if he would pardon Trump to just end any investigation that could go into him, that actually might be a step in the right direction, even though they would hate it. But I think if he'd go out and say, all right, we're going to investigate this election, even though I think nothing happened wrong. I think once all the Daily Wire pieces and Federalist pieces and National Review pieces would come out saying that those were just false words, and they actually did nothing, I don't actually think that would help much at all. Even if you're showing that you're listening, I think some of these places will prove that he's not listening, and I don't know if that would be enough to bridge much of a divide. I don't know if it'd really end up convincing anyone, to be honest.
Or he could just say, I understand election integrity is important, and actually investigate.
Right.
because
Well,
it's
if
the
you do
right thing
that.
to do. That is
Yeah.
actually an option at the end of the day.
I think there will be motivated people, and I'm talking more specifically people on the right who are going to try to debunk his any type of authentic
agree.
effort, even though I don't think it would end up being authentic knowing the people, because he's not driving the bus anyways. And the people who are, I don't think would actually try to do it. But even if they were to try to do it, I think there would be people mostly on the right who would just say he's not trying to do anything in reality.
But I mean, I think that it would not only be a matter of like they would try to debunk it. I think that they would say he's doing nothing regardless of what he's doing. And this is the basis of the problem is like I think the right has gotten to the point where they're so pissed off at the situation that it doesn't even matter if it's a good faith effort. And God knows I don't believe there have been any good faith efforts. But let's just like live in fantasy land for a moment and said Biden was actually in real life making a good faith effort. I don't even think it would matter because I think that now the right is turning into what the left was, where they have Biden derangement syndrome and they will push back on anything that it's not necessarily about Biden, but like left derangement syndrome, maybe Democrat derangement syndrome. Like they're going to push back on anything. Any single thing. Like, I'm sorry, like Trump made so many inroads with the LGBT community, so many inroads. And then all of a sudden, within a couple months of him not being president anymore, we have conservative Christians saying LGBTQ isn't a real thing and we should not even, speak to them. And I
don't say that Lauren Chick is a Christian. I'm gonna find offense.
Well, no.
Yeah.
But it's not
Truman
just it's not just her, and it could be like any issue. That just happens to be the issue that's top of mind, really. But I think it could be anything. I think that the right, student loans, Truman, I think is actually a really great one. I mean, you look at the price of college; it's astronomical. The fact is that college is a stepping stone for a lot of people based on the type of career they want. There's simply some careers where you have to go to higher education, and we should be doing something about student loans. We should be looking for ways to make college more affordable. But is the right going to have that conversation at all? No, they're going to say if you don't want student loans, don't go to college, or they're going to say whatever. They're going to make up some excuse. Like, why is the government even involved in this anyway? They're not going to come up with a solution. They're not even going to have a constructive dialogue about it simply because it's one of the left's issues. It's not about solving problems. It's not about bringing each other together. It's about continuing the fight.
I
Totally
would
agree.
push back a little bit on that. I do think the right does try to solve that problem. And I say with someone who's on the right who has a lot of student loans, yes, it's to get the government out of lending. That is the solution.
That's not a solution.
But it isn't a solution. But no, I do want to make one clarifying statement.
Gosh.
It is not going to fix the people who already have student loan debt. So those people are not feeling heard by the right. So I actually do agree with you. But there's, I think, a little bit different in there. But.
So, all right, I don't want to go down student loan, get off into that rhubarb patch either. But what I would say is that you're right. The right doesn't address it. They do say getting the government out. However, there are some things that you can't do anything about the past part. You can only make it better for those in the future. You can't go back. So let's go to Emancipation Proclamation. You can't go back in time and remove all the years lost from someone who was a slave. You can only say, I want to set you up as much as possible to succeed in the system we create going forward. I think student loans is one of those issues where you can't do anything about. Like, again, I'm one of the people whose student loans is keeping me from getting a mortgage. I am completely shut out of owning property, which is part of the American dream, basically, however you want to define it, because of student loans. You can't, but I also don't want that forgiven because I signed those papers. I understand the ramifications of just forgiving student loans. And so that's the negative consequences there supersedes my own self-interest. However, I would love for the system to be set up to help those in the future. But either way, the point is that I think what you said, Karlyn, is correct, that again, the right has its own things that they dig their heels in and ignore. And back to that being heard, again, the left doesn't feel heard even on some issues of race. I think now what you said about Trump is right about how he addressed some of the stuff with race, where I think that speech, for example, that he gave at Mount Rushmore on 4th of July, 2020 was amazing. And so that would be one of those things. But historically, the left probably doesn't feel heard about issues of race the same way that the right doesn't feel heard about issues of, well, pretty much anything, but some stuff pertaining to individual liberty, sovereignty of states and individuals, for example. But they don't feel heard by each other. So I don't want to get too hung up here. Is there anything else? So do we at least agree that contempt seems to be a factor? Whether or not we say it's the defining factor, it is a serious prevailing factor in terms of how these relationships are handled. Are we at least agreeing agreement there. Okay.
I actually think that's why, I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said, Lord, or God help us if we ever go 20 years without a war, so that we could always maintain that shared history every generation.
Yeah, the way I adapted my Watchman principle is that you have to stack sandbags together in the crisis. You have to be shoulder to shoulder doing the thing together. And that's what Jefferson was getting at, is you have to have a way where you feel unified with the people next to you that supersedes all of your ideological differences due to whatever perception of an outside threat. So that's a good point. So, okay. So the other thing I wanted to get at is, so if we agree that at least, or we've established there are some absolute ideological differences, there are maybe some physical factors that are trending in a certain way that might be relevant to that. And that those ideological differences are not just a thing that is kind of an observation or truism that we've always understood, but are becoming active in their relationships, and that it's actively antagonistic. So it's not like I have no thoughts about people from the backcountry. I just know that they're different. But it's, when I think about them, I am roused with hatred and contempt. Or if people in a city, again, I will be totally honest about my own opinions here, that whenever I was in the city and I saw people that had masks on their 4-year-olds while we were walking outside around people, I was upset. I was frustrated about the type of parent that you would be and what they were doing to their kids. You can agree or disagree with that. That's fine. But I'm being open about my own biases and my own opinions and my own frustrations that I felt towards people that I did not know, that I didn't know what type of people they were, that I just had that one piece of information that impacted me like that. So I want to be as transparent as I can about how this stuff is just playing out in my own life and consciousness as well. But so the other thing I wanted to think about is transitioning to how the side that it seems like, so I will get tribal here for a minute, the side it seems like it's advancing and promulgating a lot of this tension has gained ascendancy, right? So in the past, one of those things where people in the backwoods or in the rural areas understood that the city folk were different, and the people in the city understood that the Hicks in the hills, hills have eyes, right? That the Hicks were different. That was one thing, but then there was at least one side that started to try and impose on the rights of the other side, right? And so this is just how it is. We can go back. I'll do the disclaimer. I don't like doing this, but I will do it. The right tried to do that when they had power in the 80s and early 90s by trying to legislate their own morality and their own religion on people unilaterally across the country. And then they lost, and the left is now doing that. So if you remember the election stream, James, I thought about this earlier. Remember whenever we were talking about, because when you made the point that I thought was really good, that the more granular an issue is, the less able you are to extrapolate that on a macro level and deal with it on a macro level.
Right.
And the more specific, does that at least sum up kind of what you said
a
little bit? And so, but what I was thinking about is, remember during that election stream that we did, where I was talking about people in Omaha who went blue. And I said, it's one thing if you want to piss in your own pool. If you're in Portland, you want to reelect Ted Wheeler or elect someone from Antifa and piss in your own pool, that's fine. You can use your pool as your own personal urinal. But by electing this stuff on a macro federal level, you're pissing in my pool now too. And that's a different thing. And so it seems like there is that the left has historically, at least over the last maybe 10, 15 years, I guess Obama was elected in 2008, although I'm increasingly convinced that George H.W. Bush was way more of a progressive than an actual Republican
definitely,
or conservative. But the point is that side has been pissing in the pool of those who are in the backcountry who just want to be left alone. And so it's causing more and more of that animosity, and that the options we have for opposing it. So that's my point. The options that the conservatives has for opposing it are not available to them, that are the same options. So the way that far left orthodoxy gained ascendancy, I want to give a quick definition here for people who haven't heard me talk about flow or far left orthodoxy. We talk about CRT and critical race theory and progressivism and stuff. Far left orthodoxy is just the term that I use to generally describe that what has become an orthodoxy and a religious notion among the left. Some people call it progressivism. Michael Malice calls it progressivism. I think it goes beyond that, where it's CRT. It's an understanding of the history of the U.S. that is fundamentally different than our understanding of the U.S. about, it embraces 1619 Project ethics and understanding of history. It embraces things like color blindness as actual racism. So it doesn't agree with MLK's definition of being not racist. Karlyn, I think to your point about what anti-racism is in one sentence. It does think that someone should be, judged by the color of their skin, not by the content of their character. It believes that, it's Green New Deal. It has all these orthodoxies. You have to agree with these tenets of its religion. Climate change is going to destroy us. Race is the number one thing about your identity. Socialism is the way to human prosperity, all those other things. So that's what flow is. And that if you are someone who disagrees with any of those things, you're not part of it, because it's very rigid orthodoxy. Anyway, but the way that flow gained ascendancy and gained power in the US, this is the next stage of what I want to talk about. So we've addressed, so some physical realities. There's also some relational realities between people that have different ideologies. And now I want to talk about, how would the people who are now on the outside of those hierarchies, if you're familiar with any of the stuff Kevin and I did this last summer, what are the options available for them to try and regain some power? And the point that I want to make now is that the same options, the same avenues for obtaining power and ascendancy and influence in the culture are not available to those who lost that power and ascendancy in the culture. So a few examples would be, if you think about like the way flow gained ascendancy in higher education, for example, they brought in all these professors who believe this stuff. You think about postmodernism coming in, and then you have different critical studies, grievance studies, as Lindsay and Pluckrose and Bogosian would call it. The way those people gained ascendancy in higher ed is not available to someone who disagrees with it now. And I think what I put in the outline is that when the people who let those folks into the institutions, whether it's higher ed or whether it's media or whatever, did not understand that those folks were an insurgent ideological force. But now that they are in charge, now that flow has captured those institutions, they do know that those who aren't them are insurgent ideological forces. So they were let into the castle, but then they killed the leaders or waited for them to die and then took the throne. And then they raised the drawbridge and put guards all around the wall. So we can't get into the institutions and try to regain control of the institutions the same way that they did. So there's an asymmetry there in terms of how they rose to power. That road is not open to us, at least whenever it comes to a lot of those institutions, because they're aware of our presence in the same way that those who would probably have been opposed to them weren't aware of their presence when they gained power. There's also a time asymmetry in that they've done this gradually over the last maybe 70 plus years. And we don't have that time available to us, right? I mean, not only are those options not available to us, but there's a time asymmetry there. And then the last thing that I'll say, and again, you guys can just go and tell me what you think about this, is that there's an asymmetry of, well, I guess two, but asymmetry of momentum, in that all the momentum right now is behind them. And that, like, in other words, if you look at, what was it, some national security thing or defense, they now have an equity and diversity, equity, inclusion officer and all this other stuff. This has momentum in corporations. This has momentum in the mainstream culture. This has momentum in education. So there's an asymmetry in momentum. And then the last thing is there's an asymmetry in tactics. So I think Lindsay did an episode about this a while ago where he talked about psychopathy in individuals, and that people that are psychopaths, and I'm not saying that the left is psychopaths, or at least not broadly speaking. I'm just saying that if you just in a vacuum, someone who is a psychopath has options and tactics available to them in a conflict with someone who isn't a psychopath. So the person who's a psycho can do more things than someone who isn't. And so to kind of give a real world example, we'll not use psychopathy, but let's just talk about like if you have scruples, or general like moral compass. So a buddy of mine, whenever him and his wife got divorced, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember, they had an agreement because she moved to a city 2.5 hours away, and she took both kids with her. Those kids are now, I think, 10 and 13. So I think one is, whatever grade you are when you're 10, and the other one's about to be a freshman in high school next year. Anyway, they had an agreement that if she was going to take them, that they were going to do high school with him in the city that we live in now. And that it was going to be something that they both agreed on, and they were going to tell the kids that's the way it was, which is different than saying, hey, it's up to you, which puts the kid in the choice where they have to choose a parent, which is really harmful to them psychologically. So they had an agreement that it was like, this is where it is. So now his son is about to be a freshman, and the ex-wife has now reneged on that agreement. And not only has she reneged all that, but She's actively putting pressure on the kid to make him feel guilty if he does choose to go live with the dad. But the dad is sticking to his guns and saying, I'm not going to make my kid feel guilty about this. I'm not going to try and exert some kind of psychological warfare on him. I want him to know our relationship won't be impacted if he does stay there. Whereas the mom is saying our relationship absolutely will be impacted if you do this, going against her agreement. And so the point is that she has an advantage on him due to using these, unscrupulous tactics and unprincipled tactics and dishonest and immoral tactics that he does not have. He does not have that advantage because he's not willing to do that. Now, in a polite society, we recognize dishonesty and psychopathy and all of those things, lack of integrity, as something that should be punished. Right? But we're past that in society. That's not happening. Those things are actually being rewarded. And so the tactics of far left orthodoxy or flow in terms of how they character attack and malign their opponents and call them all types of names. They will make stuff up. Like you said, Karlyn, is absolutely correct. They will just fabricate things out of thin air to go after people. Those are, and again, dishonestly infiltrating institutions, changing definition of words, all those things. Those are not tactics that are available to opponents of flow because, or at least not now, because we have a certain set of, or at least I presume most of us have a certain set of principles and moral guidelines that we will follow that they do not have and are not willing to follow. So to go back, there's an asymmetry of momentum. There's an asymmetry of available options in terms of infiltrating institutions. There's an asymmetry of numbers, even, or at least perception of numbers. And to your point, James, earlier about tech, that I absolutely agree with. There's an asymmetry of the way in which tech and big tech influences this conflict. And there's an asymmetry of just temperament and the type of person you're willing to be in this conflict that is not available. Okay, and then here's the last one. Sorry, there's an asymmetry of understanding of the conflict. So I was on the phone with a buddy of mine a couple weeks ago, and he was really encouraged about some inroads he was making against this stuff. And at the end of the conversation, he said, "Well, I wish I was encouraged still, but I'm not." But he was like, "I agree with you." And the point I made to him was that you have to at least match the intensity of your opponent. I said, imagine a general in a war or a coach in a game rallying the troops or rallying the players and saying, "Hey, look, guys, all right, we're going to go out there and we're going to win. You don't have to want it as much as they do. You don't have to be as talented as they are. You don't have to be as dedicated or as committed or, as a fervent or whatever it is. You don't have to be as aggressive as they are. In fact, you only have to practice maybe once or twice a year or talk about it on Facebook with your friends. That's totally enough. You do not have to match them in any way, shape, or form, and that is going to be sufficient to beat them." No one would think that that's a realistic scenario, but we do have that where there's an asymmetry of dedication and commitment among those who maybe even claim to be for or against this stuff, or those who are silent and opposed to this stuff are their silence is making it is in Flow's favor. Those who are for this stuff obviously are in Flow's favor, and most of the people who are against it aren't even doing anything that really matters. They're quiet. That's what I was texting you about the other day, Karlyn. It's like they think that bitching about it on Facebook and voting red every 2 years is enough. So there's an asymmetry of commitment, even in those who are involved and claim to understand this. So we have all those asymmetries in terms of the options for how we would fight this stuff available to us. I don't know if that's the transition that makes sense from what we just talked about. But that's just another reality, I guess, I want you guys to address. That seems to me that's one of the things blackpilling me right now is all those asymmetries. So.
Truman, I think you've laid out the case for why we are totally screwed in this scenario, when we might as well go down fighting because there ain't no coming back. I honestly, and the one that really bothers me the most is that the right likes to lose. The right likes to be on the losing end.
Oh, definitely.
The right
they're at least used to it. It's not an uncomfortable place for them.
No, and I think that we can always tell what people want based on their actions. Never listen to their words. I don't care how much complaining you do on Facebook or Twitter. Look at people's actions. What are they actually doing in the real world? The right doesn't want to win. No, they don't. Couldn't even get them to go to a freaking rally in the summer, unless it was a Trump rally where they were going to be around all their friends. But take them out of that and put them in some uncomfortable situation. Never going to happen. And so, no, I don't think that they want to win. And I think that there's only so much kicking and screaming that former lefties can do to try to drag people along. And we get the experience that we deserve. And we are going to get exactly what we deserve in this country.
Yeah. When I was starting up Commutation Construct, I was trying to talk, get attention from people across different sites. And every time I talked to conservatives, I was saying, hey, this is so we can do stuff, so that we can start to make some grounds, make up work. And responses I got over and over and over again were, we have the vote, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And guess what? They didn't have the vote.
Mm-hmm.
It's honestly infuriating. That's kind of one of the reasons why we have this think tank, though, to, at least get some people who are willing to take action.
Yeah, but not only didn't they have the, and we can bicker about whether or not Trump really won, whatever. The fact is that Joe Biden is president, but that doesn't even matter. The fact that they lost doesn't even matter. They're like, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. It's all rigged. Woe is us, blah, blah, blah. And even though they've completely now lost all power in the federal government, they still don't care enough to do anything.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's certainly, as someone who comes from the conservative side, there's certainly a predisposition to more localism and not caring as much about, I guess, the federal level. And that has become a problem when the federal level becomes so extraordinarily powerful that it will control your life. We normally have the saying that I don't really care. I can sit up in my house with my guns and my family and insulate ourselves from the rest of the world when the rest of the world's burning. Well, sooner or later, the fire is going to come up to your doorstep, and it doesn't matter how much fire insurance you have, it's going to burn your house down. So there is certainly a way that people need to wake up. I'm not quite sure how to do that. I hope fighting more at a local level, which is really all we have right now, will help. I'm someone who, started writing my content, a few years ago, but it took me really until, the last 6 months to get more involved with my kid's school, who I saw getting taken over. So, even I'll admit my faults, that I was slow to the game when coming to actually making a tangible difference, rather than just talking on social media or writing stuff that a few people will read. So there's certainly a mentality change that the right needs to take. I think the more and more people who migrate to the right will probably help more of the, I guess, outgoing people, because I think there's a predisposition with the more conservative personality to sit there, be quiet, and again, sit up in your home with your guns and, hope for the best. But at some point, the fight's coming, and you do. And I think that's a big one. You hit it right in the head, Truman, is match mentality. I've talked to you personally a couple of weeks ago, and when I was a bit scatterbrained and being like, I don't know what to do, and kind of reading the next part, and I'll let you get to it when it comes to the Lord of the Rings reference, not knowing when it's like, I feel like this would be against my principleless action of saying, okay, we need to ban censorship. It's like banning stuff. It doesn't sound right. It doesn't fit my conservative ethos. But sometimes you got to realize that the free market's not a conservative principle. We love the free market because it provides the best vehicle for liberty. But once you don't know who the heck's driving that vehicle, or it's going off the road, or like I think the way you put it, it's not a monopoly, it's a cartel now.
Cartel of ideas.
Yeah.
Marketplace.
Now we can't speak to each other at the same level, or we're changing definitions. We can't speak to each other at all. So it's becoming a massive problem that the right is really struggling with, because they've never had to take action, I think, in this capacity.
Well, it's not just that they've never, one sec, James, it's not just that they've never taken action. It's that I think that they've always taken action proportional to their understanding of the threat. And I think that's an important distinction. And that's why I say, I put that post out there on my locals and on Ruben's locals. And to your point about how conservatives want to be left alone, the amount of pushback I got from people who are conservative saying, well, we just want to be left alone and live our lives. When I was saying, okay, this isn't about what you want. It's just about what do you do when you're faced with these threats. I think that it's not that they don't take action, but that their understanding of the action required does not properly map onto the threat level that we're facing now. They just see this as the next step of the culture war because they're used to everything being called socialism and everything being called communism. You're going to talk about the watering down of language. The right has done that. The left has done that with a lot of words. The right has done that with collectivism and terms we use to characterize collectivism. So they were like, well, we're used to fighting collectivism and we made it through Obama. Our healthcare is worse, but okay, I still get to go do whatever thing. And so they just don't understand we talk a lot about existential threats on the left. Everything's an existential threat. Flow's an existential threat to at least to our way of life as we understand it, at least to, what most of us think that the American experiment is. It is that, but I don't think that the right sees it as such. And so the action they're used to taking is inadequate comparative to the threat that we face. James, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's why I was saying I've had my posts where I've talked about how I feel like we need more progressively right leaning activity. More, like conservatives are, and by the definition I use, they're just the people who want to maintain the status quo, whatever they feel like it is, or whatever helps them live their lives. And if you look at the right, I would say it's, if we go back to, in terms of balkanization, the right is basically balkanized every place down to your individual household, whereas the left is trying to do it in, I would say it's not in a good way, but they're doing it by full groups and communities of people, and that gives them, that way they can influence whole groups and communities, and on the right, you're only really influencing your own house. And that's a big issue. If the right wants to start making progress, and maybe we will lose the war in the short term, but in the long term, if you want to make more rightward leaning influence and action, then we're going to need to take the time to build up our culture, to build up our communities and our groups. And we're going to need to be going through our schools and really making, in order to not lose ground, we need to make it so that within our own communities, our culture is the most important and vital part of our lives. Because, okay, if you look at things like birth rates, for example, conservatives tend to have more kids than progressives. That's just the way, that's just kind of ends up being the way things work.
We have more fun.
Yes, and we tend to grow more rapidly. Like, sure, people tend to condense into cities, but the thing is, they're being born out in the rural areas. If you have these more traditionalist, more conservative people, and they hold on to their culture, then they will grow, they will flourish. We have the potential to get out there and do all this stuff. And one of the big problems we have is we end up leaving everything in the hands of the figureheads. There is so much attention given to the Ben Shapiros of the right, the Tucker Carlsons. They're the voice. We don't need to do anything. We have them. No, you don't have anything. They are simply, they're just going to be an echo of whatever you want to hear. And they're not going to bring in new people. They're just going to give you your own self-satisfying smile. That's what they are. They're masturbation material for the most part.
To your point about conservative culture and areas, one of my Truman's tinfoil hat theories is that do you guys, Karlyn, you might be the only person who would remember this. Do you remember like the idea of the rise of the suburbs? Suburbs used to not exist, right?
Yeah.
And then they did exist. And so we have these huge suburban areas that didn't used to be a thing and now are a thing. I think that the conflict between left and right is ultimately going to boil down to the conflict between the metropolitan areas, at least I'm talking about in the US, on a granular term, or on granular level, is going to boil down to the metropolitan areas and conservative strongholds that don't exist yet, that are going to rise the same way that suburban areas did, where people are going to migrate to them. And that basically it's going to be city versus city. And the ones on the right are cities that don't exist yet, but will.
The one problem with that is that even in
there's a lot of problems with that, by the way. There's not just one problem. There's a lot. Okay, but it's my prediction either way.
But one of the big issues with that is as people coalesce into tighter population groups, higher population density, they become more left wing. They lose conservative traditionalism. Because
I disagree. I think people that are left wing concentrate into those areas because of the things that have traditionally been associated with those areas. Largely, so for example, I would say universities are a big part of that. I think places that have universities or multiple universities, look at Boston. Do you know how many schools, like colleges are in Boston? It's ridiculous. I think that's a big part of it. And a lot of those places in the North have historically been Democrat, at least since, stuff changed between North and South. So my point is I think that you have a
cause and effect.
I just think that you have the causal relationships mixed up, in terms of what makes a place more liberal, or not liberal, I don't like that word here, more leftist, versus what makes a place more conservative. I don't think it's that you put a bunch of people in an area and then they all of a sudden are like, well, what does man mean? Anything you want. I don't think that's how it works. I think that there is a correlation there historically, but it's not causal. And that as the migration. So what I'm talking about is migrations that occur intentionally, that these places that rise up will be an intentional move to different locations. And that will, as that happens, think about, have you guys ever read The Stand? It's a great book by Stephen King. So the rise of the place in, what was it? Isn't it Boulder? Is it Boulder or Colorado Springs? Boulder. So Boulder. I think so. Yeah. And Boulder in Las Vegas, they didn't put up advertisements. People just naturally migrated to the places that aligned with where they were in that.
Well, they were also guided by dreams to go to one place or another. Too.
Sure, but those dreams were things that appealed to them, right? So if you're a person who is Boulder bound and you had a dream that told you what Las Vegas was like, you wouldn't go to Las Vegas, right? You would go to Boulder. So my point is that you're right. They're guided by dreams, but the dreams appealed to those people's preferences and to their identity. And so either way, I think that that's going to, but that whole thing about the rise of cities that don't exist yet, like I said, that's Truman's tinfoil. That's not part of this conversation. This whole part, I was just trying to get at the asymmetries of what we're facing and the asymmetries of how they gained power. And I use they in a very broad sense to define flow or those supporting flow. And the avenues for people who would generally agree with us. I know we have our own opinions on different things, but who would generally say that is bad. The avenues of those who say that is bad, or that is something we need to look out for, they do not have the same options for gaining power and ascendancy. Do we at least have somewhat of an agreement, or do you at least understand the premise of what I'm putting forward there on that? Makes sense in terms of asymmetry of those opposing it.
I would,
you can go, James.
I was just going to say, well, that really brings up the thought to me that the only way that we can really sort of have a way to turn that back is to really focus on the local level. And then when it comes time to getting into more federal representatives, we need more federal representatives who support making these kinds of decisions on a local level. And rather than electing federal representatives who want to make all these things federal issues. Yeah.
Put a pin in that, because that's where I think I want to end a little bit on this. And so hold that thought, James, because I think you're right. Although for some reason, I don't think that's working right now. It's broken. But go on, Kevin. I feel like you've been holding on to at least a couple thoughts for a while.
No, most of them are gone the last couple of sips, but I would say the right, or at least conservatives are I would say principle, or bound themselves in what sometimes they believe is principle, which isn't even, like I said, the free market. When you say someone's getting banned for something and you say, well, it's a private industry, it's like, well, that's not talking about legality. We're talking about what you ought to do. And I think that's a massive problem, like an internal conflict they have. So they don't even allow themselves to jump into the fight. And also there's an infrastructure issue. Like, they have no power in higher institutions of education because they're not in it. And first you got to gain access into it. And then that's the only way you can really change it from the inside. And they've not allowed themselves to just given up all of that infrastructure. To me, it's kind of like the socialist takeover of a capitalist marketplace. Is like, socialism only works when capitalism was there first to build up the infrastructure, and then socialism can use all those cool new things. It's like when people say, well, we have internet. We got tablets to go and talk to different patients, and you can easily categorize everything that all the problems in there and communicate. And it's like, well, we're far enough, evolved enough as a society to move to universal healthcare. It's like, well, okay, if we'd have said that 100 years ago, imagine all the things we wouldn't have now if we had decided to try to expand the ability to distribute healthcare instead of actually innovating and growing. So I think it's important to understand there's an infrastructure issue there that they've kind of just given up, and now they're not going to be allowed to back in to make those changes.
Yep. Yeah. And so let's talk about the government aspect for a second, because Karlyn, you addressed how one of the things that Blackpills use is that our government is screwed, which I totally agree with. I don't know if I mentioned this to you. I know I told Kevin that you got to read Michael Malice's book. I downloaded it on a lark just because I'm very unfamiliar with that dude.
I have it.
There now, yeah.
I have it, yeah.
The one on the new right. And I had a token from Audible, and I was like, okay, I've been getting some like esoteric kind of stuff. I need something maybe a little bit lighter. And I've now went through it twice. I listened to it all in one go, driving back from Missouri to Wyoming, and then I've went back through it a second time since, and I want to go back through it a third time because there's just so many things in there. It's not very organized, I guess, in terms of his ideas. Like a chapter will have a heading, but it might as well say like mac and cheese or something. Like that is not at all descriptive of the way in which that chapter goes. It's one of those things where it's like that thing I sent you guys. I'm sure it makes sense in his mind. Like the thing I sent you guys makes sense in my mind, but to those on the outside looking in are like, okay, I understand what you're saying, but this might as well be just, however long of vignettes. But either way, I do want to talk about government for a second about that, because he is, his stuff, I think he's convinced me that I might be an anarchist in some ways. That anyone who's still watching this, hopefully will take that charitably. But at least someone who does not have any faith in our federal government and its ability to do what it's promised to do left. That's what I mean by that. So the Lord of the Rings part is something. Do you guys remember when I feel like all you guys, James, were you there whenever Karlyn did the book club thing and James Lindsay came whenever we talked about cynical theories? Were you in that?
No, I missed that one.
Okay, well, you suck. But anyway,
yeah, I'm annoyed about that one myself.
No, that's okay. But the point is one of the questions I asked James was about the government force and what's required. One of the things he had at the time had been writing and talking about was Marcuse's The Paradox of Tolerance, which basically, for those unfamiliar, boils down to let's use a different example of, let's talk about how pacifism might work as an ideology. If you have two countries that are bordering each other, and one of them is wholesale, unequivocally dedicated to pacifism and will not ever enter a conflict, they are 100% dedicated to it. And the one next to it is not so much interested in pacifism. They will invade the one interested in pacifism, take it over, and now the idea of pacifism is dead because that country has been subsumed and annexed and taken over by a place that doesn't care about pacifism. And Marcuse's idea, I think it was Marcuse, about the paradox of tolerance is that if you have a group or person or whatever that is infinitely committed to the prospect of tolerance, they will allow ideas and forces in that are intolerant, and they will allow those things to run rampant until the intolerant ultimately like quash and squelch all of the tolerant people. So the paradox is a society that started out totally dedicated to tolerance will become very, very intolerant because they allowed people to take charge that were intolerant because they tolerated the intolerant. Does that make sense? There's a lot of words there. Does that at least do justice to that? Does that seem right to those of you who are there? Or generally? Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I asked James is I said, it feels like we're in a situation where the way a lot of people conceptualize opposing this stuff is through government force. And government force and legislation and all these things is like the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, but we don't have a Mount Doom. So if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings is the ring of power, the one ring to rule them all, right? And there was a Mount Doom that you could throw it in to get rid of that power. It's done. It does not exist anymore. But government power is not something like that. We don't have a Mount Doom to throw it in. We don't have a way to get rid of the power that has been created. It's not relinquished. And the thing I put in the outline, there was a quote from one of the Lord of the Rings websites. Dude, there's so freaking many of these, it'll depress you. But although I do like Tolkien. But here's an excerpt from the page about the One Ring. And so use this framework to conceptualize the idea of government power as the One Ring. Quote, for mortals, the ring has several side effects, most of them negative. Perhaps the first was that the bearer soon developed a strong attachment to it, becoming increasingly reluctant to relinquish it. And then he goes on some stuff that's specific to Lord of the Rings lore. And then they say, merely keeping the ring without using it greatly slowed the most negative effects of the ring, but it could not do so indefinitely. So if you think about Lord of the Rings, like, right, there's Gollum, who he killed someone to get the ring initially. So he had that type of temperament where he was violent by nature, interested in power. And so the negative properties of the ring consumed him and corrupted him a lot faster than it did someone like Bilbo Baggins, who was not by nature evil, but just keeping the ring and not using it, it can maybe temporarily stave off the corrupting power or the corrupting influence of power, but it's not indefinite. It will eventually corrupt you. And so my point is that we have a One Ring in the form of government power, but we don't have a Mount Doom to throw it in to get rid of it. It's here. And this is also not a viable way of opposing flow or opposing what it seems like are the factors that are contributing to our division. Because as soon as, the right, I mean, look at what happened. It's fascinating that we were talking about Biden earlier, Karlyn, that he had or has, a complete control of the legislative powers. They have a supermajority within the Senate, Congress, and the executive, or Senate, House, and executive. And he still has passed more executive orders than any other president in history. But that's how government power works. He got rid of all those things that we liked that Trump did via executive order because he didn't have control via legislature. And so my point is that we can't get rid of government power. So I just don't know what you guys think about government power as a thing that is obviously a factor here, but not one that is useful to us in terms of our long-term goals because of how screwed it is, like you said, Karlyn, or because of the fact, and to the point that Michael Malice made in his book, I don't think he came up with this, but that I agreed with is our government has moved very far leftward in terms of growing these bloated bureaucracies and unelected people that are legislating stuff. I learned that the EPA was formed via executive order. I didn't realize that. But either way, that it's growing bigger and bigger. And the example he used, he says, look, if you have conservatives that want 0, so you have a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 in terms of what we want legislatively, conservatives just want to be left alone, right? So they want 0. We don't want to grow this thing. We don't want it. We want less of it. And the progressives want 10. They're like, no, we want all of it. Grow it by 10. And then they compromise and meet at 5. Well, the next iteration of that isn't from 5 to 10. It's from 5 to 15.
Right.
And so then you have, we just want to stay at 5, but I guess we'll meet you in the middle at 10. And then the next iteration is 10 to 20, and we'll meet at 15, and so on and so forth. And so the quote that I think this goes way back is that, conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit. And the way I would adapt that is that Republican governance is progressivism driving the speed limit. Because if one side is literally pulling you in a direction and you're only trying to stand still and not go back in the other direction, you will always incrementally move in their direction. That's what's been happening. And so whether it's that reality of that our federal government is moving more and more leftward, we have these bureaucracies, or that the power of it as it bloats is becoming more and more corrupting, and that people, they can't even conceptualize a way to destroy it or throw the ring of power of government power into Mount Doom. That I just that's a factor that I just kind of wanted to talk about. I don't really know what else to say other than things I just said, but I kick it over to you guys.
Well, and part of the reason that happens is because the conservative answer to everything is just get government out of it. They don't have a proactive plan for anything that is not get government out of that. Well, when your only plan for every possible thing is that government shouldn't be involved, guess what? You're leaving the door open for these people to come in and say, okay, you know what? We have a plan. We have a vision for how government is going to help you. Which is more appealing to the average person? Is it going to be no one's going to ever help you ever, and we're not even going to put any rules and regulations on these private companies or whatever in place to make sure that you have some protection? Or is it we're going to help you out? We're going to help, and maybe it's imperfect because it's government, and of course it's going to be imperfect, but at least we're going to help you. I mean, I think that, again, I have to go back to like the stubbornness of the right to not put together a vision, not put together a plan, because their whole thing is like, we just want people to leave us alone. That is why they keep losing.
Yeah, the other thing is the right doesn't, a lot of this stuff that the right pushes for, they say, oh, let it be done privately or let it be done through charities. But the problem is it doesn't really meet the scale that is necessary a lot of the time. So
what do you mean by that? When you say scale, are you saying that all those charities and stuff are on a smaller scale than necessary to address some of the stuff, or vice versa?
A lot of times they end up being they are localized, which I think is a good thing that conservatives tend to do, but they end up a lot of times I feel like they end up being so localized, they're not able to reach the people who are outside of that locality so that they could see how that functions. So the people who think only government can do this never get a chance to see how the alternative options could work. Although that's may just be me kind of spit-shotting, but like when I've ever looked at these types of things, that's how I typically see, like, oh, here's a scholarship program for our local school that offers this smallish amount of money, but like it's a decent amount, but like relative to the price of school, it's a smallish amount. Yada yada. But then it's just in that one local area. And I think there's a complication with this where people don't control their tax money, so they can't say, oh, I actually want to take this money, and instead of having it go to the federal institution, I want to donate it to this charity or something. There aren't really that many options. Like, you can write off charitable donations in your taxes, but that's just money you're not being taxed on. It's not actually like you still have to pay taxes. You're just
and even that the write-off for charitable donations doesn't start until you've donated $5,000. I know this because I've been part of a lot of different entities that their donations to them count as charitable contributions, and the pitch was always, you can write this off in your taxes, but you have to donate over $5,000 in order for it to even be something you can write off.
Which is ridiculous.
Right. And I'm saying, I agree with you that it's not just that it's something that you're not taxed on, but you have to meet a threshold for it. And to your point about charities, I don't know if you've ever read the High Cost of Good Intentions or The Tragedy of American Compassion, both of which are about the death of private charitable entities and the rise of government, supplanting those. Is that whenever because you were like, well, if you have to, I think the way you worded it, James, was if you're given the choice between the government has to do it or you're on your own, basically something like that. Of course, you're going to pick someone helping me, no matter who it is, over being on your own. And what happened with our private charities is that there were cities that started, because there used to be this classification of the worthy poor versus the unworthy poor. Of course, there's some problems in our current time with those definitions, but the idea was those who were poor due to circumstances they couldn't control, and those who were poor due to their own life choices. And that a lot of those private charities, historically, you had to be showing that you were working or trying to get out of it, and their explicit goal was to help you as long as necessary to get you onto your feet, but you had to be working to get there yourself. And so there were soup kitchens and homeless shelters and stuff where you had to show that you were going to work, going to do things, and they had requirements for you. And then when the government got involved in a lot of these cities, like Chicago was one of the first ones, for example, they had no requirements at all. So if you're a person and you have to choose between, I can go get the soup for free and stay here for free, or I have to go here and work in order to have it, which one are you going to pick? Of course, you're going to pick the one that doesn't ask anything of you. And that whenever that happened on a macro scale, no longer it happened, those private ones went out of business because they were dependent on donations and stuff from people, and no one was going to them. And so then once they went out of business, all that was left was those government entities that made it where there's nothing required of you in order to get all those benefits. And so then that's where we have it, where the welfare state, at least in our current iteration of it, that broadly resembles where it is now, where there's not as many places that are actively working on private entities actively working to help you get out of that circumstance, whereas the government ones are actually incentivized to keep you in those circumstances, or at least don't penalize you for remaining in them, which is effectively the same thing on one level at least.
That's exactly why a lot of conservatives tend to not like the idea of a public option with healthcare too, because of the way it just what looks better, something that's that you have to buy into or put effort towards, or something that you're just given by the government. It ends up completely controlling the markets, essentially. Eventually, at least.
Yeah, so I would say for conservatives, I think there's something Karlyn really hit on well, although I don't know if I would take it all the way, but there's a messaging problem with conservatives. They don't paint a picture. The problem is, I think I talked to recently Vesper, and she talked about how the problem with a lot of Americans is they only think America exists and like nowhere else. It's like they don't. I think it's like Andrew Clavin. He's like, a friend of his moved over from the UK over to, or didn't move. He just like visited, and he's like, what? He asked him like, what is the craziest thing about America? He's like, the media blackout. Like, you guys don't talk about the world. You only talk about America because that's the only thing important to you. And never you go anywhere else, and they pretty much talk about the world. I think there's a problem with conservatives that they think they've bought into the idea that freedom's the default condition. Freedom's scary. Most people actually don't like freedom. They don't even know what it is. They think they like freedom when people are told like, well, when you have hospital bills, are you really free? It's like, well, okay, that's different, but people are scared to be accountable for some things. And when you have government there to say you no longer have to be accountable for this thing, it just paints a much better picture for people who don't understand or want that freedom. And by conservatives saying, we'll just keep the government out of it, they don't, I mean, that's an awful explanation of the whole vision of why you ought to keep government out of it, so you can control your future rather than a bunch of other people, most of them who've not even been elected. They're just bureaucrats. So I think there's a massive messaging problem that I think Trump did a really, really good job. One, because he could match the intensity of everyone else screaming on the other side. I think he did it really well, although I don't always say his message was coherent every time, but he certainly did it in a way that the people on the right who completely reject Trump are going to lose, because they're not going to understand what he did so well to help the movement move forward and to stop stagnating. So I think it's a very, very large part messaging. I think there's a bit of an education problem in there that people don't understand what freedom and liberty is. But that's kind of a problem where you're going to sit there and like, well, we had an education problem. It's like, oh, well, you're here now. You can't just complain about the past. You actually have to make do with the political reality of today. And so, that big part is messaging rather than just saying, we're just going to stay out of it. You got to explain to people why you ought to stay out of it. Because there is something kind of like a mountain of doom set inherent in the federal system, and it's something like a convention of states or something like that. It's extremely hard to do, and you have to get a lot of support, and it takes a long time of grassroots movements to be able to do it. But most people don't even know what that is. And so if you don't understand the way your own government works, the chances are that you're going to be able to fix it yourself, or be able to get a concise message like, we'll keep government out of it, and understand why that's a good thing. It's nearly impossible.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So there's a lot there. So let's, I'd like to, I don't know how to say, hey, I agree and you're right. But also we have to kind of move on, because I know Karlyn has a hard out, I think, here in probably 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
But I'd like to kind of try to at least end on some kind of high note, because I feel like, like you said earlier, Karlyn, like, oh, you've made a case for why we're screwed. And by the way, I do happen to think that, but you're also not wrong whenever you say, but fighting seems like the most logical thing to do, and I think that it is in our nature to do that.
Yeah. Well, and who knows? Like, maybe we'll catch a break. Like, who knows? Like, you don't know what's going to happen. So you might as well, like, I mean, my whole thing is that people will get the experience in life that they deserve based on their actions and their contributions. And I think that's true of individuals, and I think it's true of large groups. And so if I want a country that is not judging people based on race, that is judging people based on the content of their character, well, goddamn, I want to fight for that. Yep. And I'm going to stand up and I'm going to push back against critical race theory. And I think that everyone should. Do I think we're going to be successful? Who knows?
Or do I know what success looks like, by the way?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or what scale it is.
But you know what? I mean, I think that people oftentimes place too much emphasis on, like, I have to get my outcome, my desired outcome in order to be successful. No, like, if we're going down, I want to go down fighting. I don't want to go down sitting on the couch watching Netflix and saying, oh, poor us, woe is us, At least that way I can feel good while we're descending into socialism, and at least maybe I'll get my student loans paid. I don't know, but
oh my gosh.
Well, depending on how much money you make, you'll be paying for them anyways for the rest of your life. So
there's a reality there to what you said, where you said, well, at least I will go down, feeling this. And I think that there is a truth there where it's, we all, one of the sayings that I remember hearing when I was a lot younger was, in life, you end up with as little as you're satisfied with. And I think we all have to do whatever is required to, I guess, go to sleep at night, for lack of a better heuristic or lens to do that. And so I think there's a lot of people for sure that they just want to be left alone and just live their lives and watch their shitty sitcoms or whatever. But I think for people like us, that even if we don't feel necessarily optimistic about it, we do have to, we have to literally, it's in our DNA. We have to fight to the last breath for sure. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. I'm being quite serious and literal there. So let's try to end on a high note, on an optimistic note here. And then I'll just kind of tell you guys the way I kind of see, actually, you know what? I'm not going to. I want you guys to kind of give what's your optimism. So we've talked about to recap, some of the issues facing us, I suppose, as a society in the United States, but also I think the West more broadly. I think Europe is facing a lot of these same issues in terms of, increasing animosity between different ideologies, insurgent ideologies and institutional capture, for example, loss of, identity and those things. But either way, we've talked about that, the physical realities, the asymmetries between people like us who are opposing this stuff and, those who are in power who have captured the institutions and who are trying to force their beliefs on us and to spread that. We've addressed a lot of those things, and the whole point, to bring it back to the original theme, it was, what does it look like? What's the difference between being blackpilled and just reading the room and just saying, hey, here's the realities. What the hell do you do about it? And so, I think part of being truly blackpilled is saying it doesn't matter what you do, and being nihilistic and saying, I'm just going to try to go out in a blaze of glory and not actually fight this stuff. And I don't think any of us are there. And then I put myself in that, though it varies from day to day, for sure. I'll be totally honest about that. But either way, like, what do you guys think is kind of, what are some things you look at that make you hopeful, in spite of these realities we've talked about, of the divides between us as people, whether it's along just regular neighbor against neighbor or within familial context, or just on a macro level as a country, going back to someone in rural, Iowa or Kansas or Nebraska versus someone who lives in Seattle or Portland. What are some of the things that make you hopeful? And then I'll close this out with a thought I have on that.
So, I think something. Oh, go ahead, James.
Actually,
Well, I think the one thing that makes me hopeful is, in fighting for this bill in New Hampshire to basically ban critical race theory, I've seen a lot of people on the right wake up to the fact that their kids are learning this stuff in school, and maybe they're not inclined to fight back for themselves, but I have seen them show inclination to fight back for their kids. And so I think that maybe this is now maybe it's lit a fire under them. And I have seen more people start speaking up and asking questions and demanding answers, and so maybe there is hope from that perspective. But again, I always think that there's reasons to fight, purely based for yourself, not necessarily based for anything else. And you have to be the one to give yourself hope. Like, nothing that any of the four of us say is going to give you hope unless you're willing to see that there is maybe a purpose for all of this. So be the one to give yourself hope at the end of the day.
All right. For me, honestly, one of the things was Trump calling out the rhinos and neocons at CPAC.
Yeah.
People on the right always complain about call out culture and cancel culture and all that bullshit. But the thing is, you need to self-regulate. If you want to, there is a responsibility with liberty that you must regulate yourself. You must make sure that you are in order to conduct your life effectively. And within conservative organizations, that needs to be done more. So I feel like that was a very important thing that Trump did with that. One of the things I'll give him applause for. I actually have a lot of problems with Trump, but that's one of the things I really like that he did. And I have been on a tirade lately about how the US has already actually lost to China. We've already lost the war, but it doesn't mean that there won't be another war. It doesn't mean that we can't still cause mayhem, start fighting again. And I think that's what's important. We need to remember, as long as we are alive, as long as we draw breath, we can fight. And even if the people who are leaders, when they're not, I don't think politicians should even be leaders. I think they should just be representatives. And I think that's something that that is lost in American culture recently. People think of them as leaders, as people who they should listen to and trust. That's a big issue. Unless they're on the other side, then they shouldn't listen or trust them. But I feel like we need to kind of redefine what our principles are and how we want to approach them. And I believe that being able to have these kinds of conversations helps spread that message, and it helps get more people considering that. So that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, I would say for me, just real quick, I have faith that it will turn around. Like, I'm not even close to being blackpilled or anything, and I'm certainly not an optimist, but I have faith it'll turn around. I think, people who look at these horrible diseases like cancer will never discover a cure for cancer. I have faith that we'll discover a cure for cancer. People talk about climate change and the ideas that we want to implement a change to turn it around. I'm like, all those ideas suck, but I do have faith we will find an answer eventually. So I think a lot of that faith, and by faith, I don't mean just like I'm going to sit back and let it happen. There's a good saying that even God can't drive a parked car. Like, you can't just sit there and have faith that someone's going to do something and be like, I can just sit here on the sidelines and not do anything. There's a big difference between that and just saying someone like a Ben Shapiro is going to come and save us, because that's not going to happen. So it isn't. But to me, faith is, it's not time to freak out. It's not time to say burn it all down. We need to keep moving forward. We need to find a way. The best way to do this is find a gripping idea that most people are going to latch onto and be able to say, okay, this stuff is BS. We need to turn this around. I cannot be fighting with my neighbor every day just because we can't believe in the same objective truth. So I have faith that will turn around.
That's good. Although I will say that there's a difference between faith rooted in evidence and faith that is not. Like, if you drive a tank out onto some ice, you can have all the faith in the world that that ice isn't going to crack, but it doesn't matter how strong your faith is. It's not going to keep that ice from cracking. I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but my point is that there's different kinds of faith. Anyway. So what I will say is that I think I said adorable to what you said, Kevin, about your optimism there.
Nice.
And I agree, and I'm okay with it. We got to have that. We have to have that. And I'm not being sarcastic or dismissive. James, to your point about China that we've already lost, I think what I sent in the outline is that we were one generation removed from the Revolutionary War, and the presence of Great Britain and France didn't stop the forces at the time from engaging in a civil war. And so I don't think the presence of China or Russia as a dominant global power will prevent the forces that are driving us apart from continuing to do so. I just don't think it's part of the math for them, to be honest, no matter how vulnerable it leaves us in the long term. But here would be my final thought of optimism is that I do agree that we are not more divided than we've ever been. We were literally shooting each other along the Mason-Dixon line and on other sides of it. We had Sherman waging his war of scorched earth across the South whenever we were the most divided we've probably ever been. So we're clearly not there yet. I do think we're trending that way. A solution I have in mind is, and I'll end with since it's Palm Sunday, I got to put my theology hat on one more time. But there is a story about Nehemiah in the Old Testament. And he was a guy this is after Israel had been conquered. And he found out that the walls and everything had been destroyed. And so especially at this point in time in history, having a solid defense around your city or your city state or whatever was very important to maintain your people or your culture there. And so Nehemiah finds out that the walls around Jerusalem have been destroyed. And he asks his king, he might have been under maybe the Assyrians. It wasn't the Babylonians, I don't believe. He says, I want to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls around the city of my people. And he goes back, and there are a lot of force, and the king grants him permission to do so, gives him papers and everything to go do that. But there's this interesting picture in Nehemiah chapter 4. I'd encourage you to go look at it. Whenever they find out there's a lot of people who wanted to oppose them. And it says that there were people that were basically working with a tool in one hand to relay bricks and stuff, and they had a sword in the other. So they had one hand on the defenses and rebuilding the defenses around their institution, and another hand on the instrument for defense and opposing those who would maybe come and fight them. And I think that there's a lot of people who have internalized that idea without it being explicit, who are like, yeah, we're going to need some new institutions. We're going to need to build some things up. Because like you said, Karlyn, government is toast. I think higher ed is toast. I think that's one of those things, to be honest. Yeah. I think there's in a lot of ways that the education system generally is toast. Deb Philman talks about that a lot. If you're not familiar with her channel, anyone watching, you should check it out. The Reason We Learn, it's great. But education is toast, but there's also people who understand, look, we have to fight against the ideological takeover with one hand and what's going on. Kevin, like you going to that PTO meeting would be an example of that. But also work to build our own stuff, to build stuff up. And this is something I used to be opposed to, but I think it's kind of inevitable at this point, and not necessarily a bad thing. And so I'm optimistic about the people that understand what we're facing to the degree that they are working to oppose stuff and also try to build something that resembles sane and grounded in reality and grounded in ideas and principle. Principle's a big one there. So that makes me optimistic. And again, there's models for this that date back thousands of years. But I don't think we're there yet on whether it's the trajectories of being divided enough physically, like you're asking earlier, Karlyn, that would necessitate separation, or divided enough that we would just want to start wringing each other's throats. Kevin, I appreciate your white pilling to a degree. I just don't think we're there yet. I think we're trending that way, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I guess I'll put it that way. And I mean that, even though there's a part of me that's going, what? You don't think it's but I really think that we're not there, or at least I have to believe that. Right. So anyway, I guess that kind of wraps that brings us to the end again. Karlyn, I know you got a hard out. So why don't you start, everyone introduce yourselves, and then I'll close this out here for who we are and where people can find you.
Yeah, so Karlyn Borysenko, you can find me on Locals, kb.locals.com, on YouTube, just under my name, and, on all the other places too.
Sweet.
All right, James Darian, Commutation C on Twitter, James Darian on any other social media, and you can find me at commutationconstruct.locals.com. I will have the link in the description for all of us.
I'm Kevin from Engineering Politics. You can go to engineeringpolitics.locals.com, search Engineering Politics on ThinkSpot. Medium, I'm republishing stuff on Medium now. On Twitter at ENG_politics, though I'm never on there because it's awful. And yeah, that's where you can find me.
Sweet. And I'm Truman. You can find me at returntoreason.locals.com, My Mundane Mind on Twitter or on YouTube at Return to Reason. And this has been, the Ember think tank. We appreciate everyone watching. Sorry if this is depressing, but we have to deal with realities as they come. And then that's really the only way to try and find solutions, or at least trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell would say. So thanks for watching, everyone, and we will catch you next time. Peace.